Chapter 36:43. Bai Shuili glared at him, unable to believe that he had really scalded Little White like a tortoise. She stared at him, then tears welled up in her eyes, but she stubbornly refused to let them fall. He looked at her with a faint smile. After a long time, she finally squeezed out a sentence. Yim Yulin, I hate you to death. Just as he was about to say something, she had already reached out and slapped him away, accidentally hitting his face. She had slapped the chief. Yim Yulin stared at her face for a while and said coldly, You haven't changed at all. You haven't either. You're still so cruel. She was angry that he had stewed Little White. Although she was a little scared, she still had the guts to look at him. Yim Yulin looked at her, not caring about his face that had been slapped. He snorted lightly and got up. He looked like he was angry. Bai Shuili didn't care about him. She didn't want to admit that he was wrong. It was his fault that he had killed Little White. He was a bad person. Yim Yulin was a little angry. He was a man, a powerful man, and he had been slapped by his wife. He shook his head. She hadn't changed at all. He always had work to do, so he had to go to work. When the powerful man got into the car, he called Secretary Li and asked her to bring breakfast. Actually, thinking about it, he was really despicable. He asked for it. He didn't even get to eat breakfast, and he even got slapped. She believed him when he said he had stewed Xiao Xiao. She was really stupid. Yim Yulin's car stopped downstairs of the general office. He called Wen Yuan again and asked about Xiang Nan's situation. Then he got out of the car and walked into the general office. Along the way, everyone who saw him called Yim Yulin. In the apartment, Bai Shuili looked at her hand and muttered, Stingy. It was just an accident. However, did he really kill Xiao Xiaobai? She sat there in a daze for a while, then her eyes reddened, just as she was in a daze, and then woke up and ran over barefooted from the children's room. Mom. Bai Shuili came back to her senses and hugged her little body. Bai Ainin wrapped her arms around her neck and stared at her for a long time before saying softly, Is Dad back? Bai Shuili was stunned again. She didn't expect Ainin to care so much about this, so she forced a smile and said, I came back, but Dad was very busy with work. Ainin asked again, hugging her even tighter, Mom, are we still going abroad? Bai Shuili's voice shook, and then she whispered, Ainin, do you want to stay? Ainin leaned on her shoulder and said very softly, I like Daddy. Bai Shuili felt a little sad. She patted Ainin. You can still come back to see him in the future. Ainin had always been like a boy. She didn't act coquettishly, but this time, she rubbed against her mother's chest. I want to be with Daddy. She was talking about being together for a long time. Bai Shuili was stunned. Then, she sighed in her heart. She was at a loss. Perhaps it was a mistake to take the job back home this time. She thought that it would be fine to come back for half a month. She thought that he would forget about her once he had a family. Nothing was important anymore, and they would never cross paths again. Chapter 36:44. On the second day after she returned to the country, he had already dragged her to bed. She didn't say if he had forced himself on her, but she knew very well if she had really resisted. Bai Shuili reached out and patted him, comforting her gently for a while. Luckily, Ainin wasn't a very pretentious girl. She just expressed her thoughts to her mother and then left the decision to the adults. In this aspect, it was indeed very worry-free. Bai Shuili carried her up and then went to brush their teeth and wash their faces. Then, she made breakfast for him and then sat down and ate breakfast. She looked at Bai Shuili and suddenly said, Mommy, I want to go to the nursery. Bai Shuili was stunned. Then, she asked her, You don't like to be with Mommy? If I go to the nursery, Mommy will have a lot of time to herself. And then spoke fluently. Bai Shuili looked at her. Is it your own idea, or did Daddy teach you? Daddy taught me. Bai Ainin easily betrayed her father. Bai Shuili was speechless, but she couldn't say too much to Ainin, and was very attached to this father of hers. After breakfast, she tidied up and brought Ainin out to go to the bookstore. When she went to get her purse, she found a card on the bedside table. It looked quite familiar. She walked over and reached out to pick it up. Then, her eyes felt a little warm. She had used this card before. In the past, when she and Yim Yulin had just gotten married, he had given it to her. Then, after she left him, he left it here. What did he mean by putting it here again? She looked at it for a long time until Ainin pulled her. Then, She came back to her senses and let it out. Because it was past the morning rush hour, there weren't many people on the subway. Bai Shuili brought and to find a place to sit down. Then, she looked at the platform and taught and how to look. If it was the old Bai Shuili, she wouldn't take the subway. She felt that everywhere was filled with the smell of cheap goods. She would always travel in a top-of-the-line sports car. She wanted to be as high-profile as possible. But now, she felt that this was pretty good. She didn't drive that BMW. Subconsciously, she didn't want to become a woman who was completely kept by Yi Mulin. She didn't want to use his card either. She would feel that she would lose her self-esteem. The subway arrived at the station she wanted to go to. She got off and took it out of the platform to find the bookstore she was looking for. The bookstore was very big and wanted to read about children's science. She took a book and sat on the sofa obediently. Bai Shuili was looking for reference books on the other side. When it was overseas, she often read in the bookstore. She would look for information and stay there for the whole morning. However, to everyone's surprise, there was a customer who was wearing the same clothes as Bai Shuili today. She bought a book and walked out. Anin saw her and immediately got up to chase after her. The long legs in front of her were walking very fast. Anin called for her mother a few times, but did not stop. Soon, she was lost. Bai Anin stood on the streets of B City. Looking at the unfamiliar environment, she burst into tears. I don't usually cry. I want to be stubborn, but I'm really scared. Bai Anin burst into tears. Coincidentally, a traffic policeman came over and squatted down. Little girl, did you get lost with your parents? Bai Anin looked at the pretty traffic police officer and nodded shyly. Then big sister will take you to find mom, okay? Can you tell me where you got lost? The traffic police lady asked patiently. Chapter 36:45. The traffic police lady looked in the direction of her little finger and was stunned. It was Nocturnal Chieftain. No, Nocturnal Chieftain's family had been interviewed before. It wasn't this one at that time. Thus, she said patiently, "This is Nocturnal Chieftain. It's Dad," and then said stubbornly. The traffic police lady was speechless and looked at her, and also looked at her. After a long time, the traffic police lady coughed lightly. A lying child will be taken away by a big bad wolf. And then bit her lip and said with tears in her eyes, "It's Dad, he's not lying." The traffic police lady looked at Bai Anin's temperament. Although there weren't a lot of bodyguard around her, this baby looked very noble. And that face really looked 70% similar to the top 5 most powerful men in B City. However, this was Nocturnal Chieftain's child. Didn't that mean that Nocturnal Chieftain had an affair? The traffic police lady felt that this matter was quite serious, so she asked her superior for advice. She held the precious baby in one hand and the phone in the other. "Director Lin, I found a child on the road. He said that Nocturnal Chieftain is his father. Throw him into the rescue station," Chief Lin said without hesitation. The traffic police nodded and then looked at Bai Anin sympathetically. However, Director Lin thought about it and made another call that he didn't think was very important. "What's the child's surname? What's his mother's name?" The traffic police lady perked up and asked again. Bai Anin's eyes were like black beans. "My surname is Bai. My mother's name is Bai Shuili." Director Lin heard it, and then his body softened. Fuck, what kind of shit was this? It seemed to be a great merit, but Bai Shuili was Nocturnal Chieftain's ex-wife. This child was an illegitimate child. He definitely couldn't send it over directly, or the chief would be angry. As a superior, no one liked their disgraceful privacy to be exposed. Director Lin was worried, and at the same time wanted to show his merit. He first called Nocturnal Chieftain and felt that this was the most appropriate. When Director Lin called the general office, the operator outside first picked up the call. Then, it was Secretary Li. Secretary Li was his trusted aide. After Director Lin spoke, Secretary Li was stunned. Then, he asked him to take care of the child. He didn't hang up the call and went straight to the small conference room. At this moment, Yi Mulin was having an internal meeting with more than 10 subordinates. Secretary Li came in with a strange expression and whispered something in his ear. Yi Mulin looked at her a little surprised, but soon made a decision. "Let him send it in to me." Secretary Li asked softly, "Aren't we going to inform Miss Bai? After all, she might be nearby." What she didn't dare to say was that this was the general office. Did her boss want everyone to know that he had such an illegitimate child outside? Mulin only said lightly, "Just do as I say." Secretary Lee replied with an "oh," and immediately went to do it. He told Director Lin, "The chief asked you to send an over. He's in a meeting right now. He might be able to spare 5 minutes to entertain you." Director Lin was deeply grateful. He was excited to death, but he also felt conflicted. "Secretary Lee, do you think I should send the young master off grandly or quietly?" Chapter 36:46. After Secretary Lee finished speaking, Chief Lin pulled the little noble person over with some disbelief. He looked at it from left to right and felt that it was still a little boy. Instead, the young traffic policeman said softly, "She's actually very delicate. Chief Lin, look at her facial features. She's especially beautiful." Chief Lin looked at it and nodded. "It's very nice. Thinking about it, how could the daughter of the Night Chieftain's daughter not be good-looking? My goodness, I've always thought that Nocturnal Chieftain is a very upright person, but it turns out that he also enjoys the fortune of having 2 wives." Chief Lin despised them in his heart, but he still had to flatter them on the surface. After weighing the pros and cons, he decided to personally send them over. Of course, the little traffic policeman would have to record the merit, a great merit. When he got into the car, he said, "Go to my office tomorrow. You don't have to work so hard outside anymore. Girls should find a suitable position." The little policeman exclaimed at his heart. He went over to Huggin and gave her a kiss. They really were fewa, and wasn't afraid. She was taken away by Chief Lin, just like that. Along the way, the police car cleared the way. Chief Lin even specially got out of the car to buy a child's favorite snacks to coax her. After the car arrived at Mulin's office, Mulin was directly brought to Secretary Lee. Secretary Lee hugged and kissed her. "You look just like your mother." Bai Anan looked at Secretary Lee. "I want Dad, and he will take you there now." Secretary Lee liked Anan very much. Her feelings were different from others. She had been Yi Mulin's secretary since he was still Lawyer Yi. She was still his secretary now. She had been Yi Mulin's secretary for more than 10 years. Just when Secretary Lee was about to go over, Yi Mulin had already finished his team meeting. A group of people walked out of the conference room. He walked in front, looked at Nin, and smiled. Anan was stunned. She immediately rushed over and hugged his leg. "Daddy!" Yi Mulin did not avoid the others. He reached out and picked Anan up. His tone was very gentle. "Where's Mommy?" Anan blinked her big eyes. Anan lost Mommy. Mommy ran away. Yi Mulin coughed softly. "Mom is an adult now. She won't get lost." Tears welled up in Anan's eyes. "But I can't find her." Yi Mulin sighed and remembered Bai Shiwili in his heart. He would definitely teach her a lesson when he returned. She had lost the child when she went out with him. She had not realized it yet, right? He turned to look at Secretary Lee. "Call Bai Shiwili and tell her that Anan is here." "Bai Shiwili?" Secretary Lee stuck out her tongue. What a distant form of address. Yi Mulin glared at her, and she left immediately. She even looked at the group of leaders behind Yi Mulin. Everyone had a complicated expression on their faces because this kind of thing was common. However, it was rare to see someone like Yi Mulin who exposed his private life to the public. No, it had never happened before. Looking at the way Nocturnal Chieftain was holding the child, his heart was really in pain. Chief Lin carefully smiled along. Today is also a coincidence. Yi Mulin looked at Anan and asked softly, "Why is it like this?" Bai Anan looked at him blankly. "I don't know what Dad means. You clearly remember Mommy's phone number, don't you?" Yi Mulin's hand patted her little but gently. "Naughty," and reached out and hugged his neck. She buried her little face in his, and her voice was muffled. "I just miss Daddy." Chief Lin's heart skipped a beat. Had he been fooled by this brat? Chapter 36:47. Although Director Lin was cursing in his heart, he didn't dare to say it out loud. He didn't dare to show any unhappiness on his face. What a joke! How could he not be happy? He really wanted to cry. While Director Lin was feeling sad, Bai Anan was hugging her father. Her little body was in his arms, her arms hugging him tightly. Yi Mulin whispered a few words to Secretary Lee. Secretary Lee smiled and welcomed Director Lin. The other subordinates didn't dare to say too much. They just looked at them and praised how cute they were. Yulin carried by Anan into his office without any hesitation. Along the way, he received many gazes. This isn't the only child of Chief Yi. This one looks cuter. It looks more like Chief Yi. It's his ex-wife's child. His ex-wife is beautiful. I heard that they were together for a few years after their divorce. It's true love. A true love that can't be broken up by family and power. They only dared to speak softly. How would they dare to let Yulin hear them? However, he was going to be gossiped about since he was carrying an Anan in public. He carried an Anan. An Anan's sharp ears caught a word. She asked softly, "Daddy, what's an ex-wife?" Yulin smiled. An ex-wife is a wife who was together in the past, but was forced to separate because they weren't suitable for each other. Everyone present froze. Yulin stood still and asked the little fellow in his arms, "Is there anything else you want to ask?" And Anan looked at him with her big black eyes. She asked softly, "Was Mommy not suitable or was it forced?" Not only did an Anan want to know, everyone present pricked up their ears. Yulin looked at an Anan and smiled. His voice was slightly hoarse. "I had no choice." An Anan replied with an "oh." After a long pause, she asked again, "Does Daddy still like Mommy?" "Daddy likes you too." This time, Yulin answered in a different way. The child didn't quite understand. However, the gossips around them were clear. It was clear that Chief Yi couldn't forget his ex-wife. He liked her very much. After Yulin finished speaking, he walked into his office. Before he closed the door, he said to Secretary Li, "Call by Shueli over." Secretary Li's heart skipped a beat. He felt that when the words by Shueli came out of the bureau chief's mouth, every word sounded different. She immediately dismissed Director Lin and called by Shueli to tell her that An was here. On the other side, Shueli was naturally very confused. She didn't even realize that she had rushed over after paying the bill. Yulin's office was an independent building. The hundreds of people in this building were all his subordinates. Before Shueli rushed over, almost everyone knew that Yulin had an illegitimate child. When she arrived, Secretary Li was waiting downstairs and welcomed her in. "Secretary Li, how did An come here?" Shueli frowned, feeling a little anxious. Secretary Li smiled. "I don't know what's going on. I only know that Director Lin of the Transportation Bureau personally sent it. Surely, don't worry. An is fine now. She's with the chief." It was because of this that Shueli was worried. She realized that An was very attached to Yulin. She was so persistent that she didn't know what An's reaction would be if she took An abroad. Chapter 3648. Shueli nodded and Secretary Li winked at her. "I'll bring you a cup of lemon tea." "Thank you." Secretary Li closed the door just as Shueli finished speaking. She turned her head. The office in front of her was huge and simple, but every piece of furniture was especially heavy. The floor was covered with a low-key woolen carpet. Beside the wall was a large bookcase with a leather sofa. Opposite them was a large office desk. There was an ornament on it that Shueli could recognize. It had been sold for tens of millions at an auction, and he had actually placed it here. Was he not afraid that someone would come and check on him? Yulin was sitting on the sofa, patiently feeding An snacks. He heard the noise and glanced at Shueli. Then, he said calmly, "You came pretty fast." There was a hint of mockery in his tone. Shueli could obviously hear it, but it wasn't the time to be calculated with him. She walked over and squatted down to look at An. "Why are you here?" An looked at her and pouted. Mommy ran away, and the baby couldn't catch up to Mommy. Shueli felt strange. Mommy didn't leave. Mommy was there the whole time. An said stubbornly, "Mommy just left, and the baby was crying on the street." Shueli wanted to say something, but Yulin's tone was low. "There was someone in the bookstore wearing the same clothes as you." She walked out, and An mistook you for her. This was from the surveillance footage, and it showed how careless Shueli was as a mother. Shueli was stunned for a moment, and then she felt a little scared. As a mother, which mother wouldn't worry about the safety of their child? Shueli was prepared to beat An up. She used to spank her when she was disobedient. But just as she was about to do that, Yulin pulled her over. In a split second, she was lying on his lap. It was warm, and there was an indescribable secret feeling. Bai Shuili was stunned for a moment before she screamed, Yi Mulin, what are you doing? You're crazy, you jerk. Let go of me. His fingers caressed her gently, and his voice was hoarse. Shouldn't I be punished for doing something wrong? She knew what he was thinking. She closed her eyes and screamed, Yi Mulin, you're too despicable. Do you think I don't know that you hit my dick to satisfy your perverted thoughts? By shares? Perverted thoughts? Bai Anan leaned against her papa and asked in a low voice, What do you mean by perverted thoughts? Even at this time, Yi Mulin still had the heart to answer his daughter's question. That's what Daddy thinks when he's facing Mommy. What kind of explanation was that? Bai Shuilan was furious. She tried her best to roll her eyes and glare at him, but he had already slapped her. But Bai Shuili was already in her early 30s, and she had even been beaten up by her ex-husband. If word of this got out, it would be very embarrassing. She shouted angrily, Yi Mulin, you bastard! Let go of me! Let go of me! He did not let go and pressed her down, saying to Anan, Do you want to be punished for doing something wrong? Anan didn't dare to pick a side, but Yi Mulin gave her courage. She gulped and said carefully, I want to buy stocks. Bai Anan. Bai Shuia gritted her teeth. Chapter 36:49. It hurts. Yi Mulin, you bastard, you're hurting me. She screamed at first and then started crying. She cried sadly and embarrassedly, especially when Secretary Lee came in with tea and saw the cruel scene. He quickly left. She was hit by him, and others saw it. Yi Mulin looked in the direction of the door, then looked at the cat urine on her face and Anan's curious gaze. So he said in a low voice, Anan, go to the lounge. Bai Anan looked at him curiously and felt sorry for her mother. She said softly, Dad, do you have that kind of perverted thought now? Yi Mulin had hit her. His fingers gently caressed the place where she had been hit. He smiled. You have to ask Mom later. Anan looked at the smile on his face and felt that her father didn't seem to be that angry. So she was relieved and ran to the lounge, leaving a gap to peek. Bai Anan. Yi Mulin's voice was heard. Don't peek. Oh, Anan said in a regretful tone. Yi Mulin looked at the door, and then his hand went into the sweater. He was a little dissatisfied through the clothes. When he touched the place where she was hit, her body trembled and she cried, Yi Mulin, you've already hit me. What else do you want? He leaned over and pressed his lips against her shoulder, gently nibbling on it. Then he nibbled all the way to the back of her ear. His voice was so hot that it was as if he had a mouthful of sand. You can't hit me after doing something wrong. His voice was harsh against her ear, but if his hand hadn't been so wicked, she would have thought he was really angry. But his hand, she was sure that he was making use of it. She struggled for a while. Yi Mulin, don't move. Don't move. Yi Mulin didn't stop. As he tortured her, he whispered in her ear, Does it hurt? She cried in pain. It hurts. What does it hurt? His voice sounded like he was coaxing her, but it sounded very disgusting to her ears. He did it on purpose, but if she didn't say it, he had a way to make her say it. When he spoke, his hot breath blew on her ear. It was painful and itchy, like ice and fire. Yi Mulin, stop. She couldn't help but cry. She was deliberately disfigured by him, and he was neatly dressed on the sofa in his office. She wondered when the man had become so obscene. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get away from him. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore and could only cry on his lap. She felt ashamed, and it was just a wall away, and she was made to be like this by him. She cried and murmured, Do you treat other women like this here? He hit her. It hurt so much that she gasped for air as she cried. Yi Mulin was supposed to be a punishment, but he was a little tempted by it. In addition to the feeling in his hands, he really wanted it. However, when he thought about how Anan was inside, he held back no matter how hard he tried. His voice was hoarse. Other women didn't give birth to my child. Why would I hit them? She cried so miserably that her tears stained his pants. It was wet and cold, making him uncomfortable. Chapter 36:50. Yi Mulin lowered his head to look at her tears, his voice a little low. Do you know fear now? If Anan didn't meet Chief Lin's people today, but a bad guy, would you still have the chance to sit here and get beaten up? She was stunned. His voice became stern again. Shueli, and only has us as her parents. She's gone and can't be found. We can have another child, but she won't have the chance. Do you understand? Her lips moved. She's fine here. Yumulin, I've been living like this for the past few years. That's good. You haven't even realized your mistake. His face turned cold. Bai Shueli shook her head. That's not what I meant. I mean, I might not be a good mother, but are you a good father, Yumulin? Or do you think that I can choose many things? He stared at her for a while before saying softly, Bai Shueli, you can't choose, but do you think I can? How can I choose if you're gone? You can choose not to marry when you on, she said a little angrily. After saying that, she froze and turned her face away awkwardly. They were blaming each other like this. It was as though the past had been torn open and everyone was in pain. Bai Shueli refused to speak anymore. He looked at her and asked softly, Bai Shueli, do you blame me? She lowered her eyes. I don't. I blame myself. He looked at her coldly and then put her down. He walked to the resting room to comfort Anan. That child who peeked must be scared out of her wits. Anan was scared out of her wits. Even though her mother was crying, she thought that it was her father bullying her mother, just like children bullying each other. But then they started talking and it didn't seem right. Her father was angry, and so was her mother. They were ignoring each other. Was this a fight? Anan's face fell. When Yumulin walked over to her, she ran to the sofa and sat down. The baby didn't peek. Yumulin walked over and squatted in front of Anan, smiling. Anan, every pair of parents will fight. Will others have perverted thoughts too? Anan asked in a low voice. She just wanted to know if her parents were the same as others, because since she was young, her father was not around, so she felt that it was different. Yumulin hesitated for a moment, then smiled faintly and reached out to caress her little face. There will be. Daddy loves you too. It's just that I didn't know you existed before. Anan used to be very dependent on him, but now she was a little suspicious. He knew it was because he bullied Bai Shueli, and was raised by Bai Shueli. So, of course, he was close to her now, and it still looked at him warily. Then, she ran out of the bedroom and ran outside. Yumulin hugged her from behind, and the little girl was carried back, and Anne's little body wriggled around like a caterpillar. I want to be with Mommy. She was always a child, and when she saw that her father was not the same as he had been yesterday, she burst into tears. Yumulin was a little confused. Yesterday's baby was different from today's baby, and the baby, just now, was different from today's baby. She had started to dislike him so quickly. Chapter 36:51. Yumulin comforted her. Mommy is here. But Mommy cried too. Anan cried very sadly, fully showing Bai Shueli's strong genes. Then, Yumulin understood that this girl looked like him, but in fact, it was all a lie. In her bones, she was a small Bai Shueli, smart but not on the right path. She only knew how to act coquettishly. However, he had a feeling of surviving a disaster. It seemed that he was very glad that she was like this. The little girl he wanted was like her. It was not good to be too independent. Girls needed to be coaxed by men. Yumulin had endless patience for the little girl. He squatted down and reached out to pinch her soft little face. His voice was unbelievably gentle. Then if Daddy coaxes Mommy and Mommy stops crying, can I not cry too? She raised her little face and looked at him. Then the baby has to think about it. Anyway, she couldn't just agree to him casually. Yumulin chuckled and kissed her. Then Daddy will go and coax Mommy, okay? She looked at him and said fiercely, don't hit Mommies but any more. Okay. He made a pinky promise with her. Can Anan forgive Daddy? Bao still needs to think about it. Anan wasn't fooled. He was extremely arrogant and unreasonable. But Yumulin felt that it was good. After his daughter was spoiled, the boy couldn't stand her bad temper and wouldn't be easily cheated away. He kissed her again and walked out. He saw that the child's mother was still crying. She probably didn't want to scare Anan, so she didn't go in. Yumulin adjusted his tie, walked over and sat down. He reached out and put his arm around her shoulder. Are you still angry? Bai Shueli pushed his hand away. Her voice was nasal. It was obvious that she had been crying for a long time. It's none of your business. Anan and I will go back to America. He looked at her. Go back to America and continue to be a little translator to earn money to support Anan. What kind of life can you give her? It wasn't that he looked down on her, but he felt sorry for her. She used to like to spend money so much. These years must not be very rich. So he was angry but also distressed. Baishuali looked up at him and smiled. Yes, I can't earn much money, but at least I can let Anan live a normal life. He looked at her. Baishuali continued. The first year I went to America, I washed dishes at a Chinese restaurant when I was with Huayan. Yimulin was stunned for a moment, then looked at her in shock. Baishuali hugged herself and turned her head to look at him. I worked 14 hours a day to earn dozens of dollars to pay the rent and to give birth to Anan in a proper hospital. Things are so much better now than they were back then. After Yimulin recovered from his shock, he whispered, Even if you wanted to leave, you would have brought money with you. Why didn't you? I did. She bit her lower lip, but someone stole it. This time, he didn't know what to say. He couldn't hit her, nor could he scold her. He could only comfort her because he was still angry at her. She can't even take care of herself. How can she take care of Anan? Baishuali turned her face away and said in a low voice, Yimulin, I can take care of myself. You've seen that I'm doing well these past few years. So good that you lost Anan after coming back for a few days? He looked at her coldly. Baishuali couldn't help but say, It was an accident. Chapter 3652. Yimulin was angry, and his tone was not very good. Baishuali was stunned for a moment, and then turned her face away. She was angry, but more than that, she felt wronged. Yes, she was not good enough, but she was like this, and she had worked very hard. She thought she was very good now, but he still looked at her as if she was useless. She didn't talk to him when she was angry, and tears fell from her face. It was not like the kind of awkwardness before, but she really felt very wronged, and there was a feeling of breaking up with him, never to see him again in this life. It was not that she didn't feel anything when they met again, but it was also strange. In addition to being Wan Yuan's husband, it was also because of his power. She felt oppressed in this office, and she finally had to admit to herself that this man was no longer the previous Yimulin. She lowered her eyes, and tears fell one by one, dripping on the back of her hand, but she did not wipe them. She was unwilling, and still wanted to save face. Yimulin stared at her eyes, and then fell on the back of her hand. He knew that she would lose her temper, but he did not expect that she would cry like a child. Just as he was about to say something, Secretary Li pushed the door open and came in, followed by a politician. As soon as the two saw the situation inside, they hurriedly left. Yimulin raised his eyes and glanced at the little girl who was crying a little hard. His voice was much gentler. You're a mother, but you still like to cry so much. And will laugh at you. She still twisted her face and said a little willfully and angrily, and will give it to you. I'll go by myself. Yimulin reached out a finger to lift her chin. She wanted to slap it away angrily, but he quickly pinched her chin, and Junyan leaned over and whispered, Angry! Her face was hiding, but he just had a way to pinch it. The more she dodged, the stronger his strength became. In the end, a fingerprint was pinched on her chin, and it was green and purple. Yimulin let go of his hand and laughed. He reached out and dragged her into the bathroom, pressing her shoulders from behind to look in a mirror. She refused, but he was too strong. He turned his face around, almost touching her face, and said, Put ice on it, or others will think that I force you to do special service just now. Special service? Baishuali was stunned for a moment before she came back to her senses. She stared at him and said, Yimulin, you're too despicable. He was still sticking close to her face as he chuckled lowly. How am I hateful? If I was really hateful, I would have forced you to serve me. With tears in her eyes, she looked at the two people in the mirror, a little shocked. He smiled again. What's so strange about it? All men like this, and I'm no exception. Baishuali was still staring blankly at the mirror. After a long time, she squeezed out a sentence. Yimulin, you are too shameless. He stared at her for a moment, then smiled. Is that so? She lowered her eyes. You are so busy and old. Why are you still thinking about these things? After talking for a long time, he didn't reply. She looked up and froze for a moment. Yi Mulin's eyes were fixed on her reflection in the mirror. His gaze was terrifying. She was stunned. He smiled. I'm old, aren't I? As he spoke, he gently rubbed the bruise on her chin with his fingers and said meaningfully, let's try it tonight. Shirley bit her lips. Chapter 36:53. He carried her into the lounge. Sleep with an inn for a while. Let's have lunch together. I'll take you back at night. She got down and looked down. Aren't you going to the hospital? Oh, he said as if he had just thought of it. You're right. You can go with me then. I'm not going. Bai Shuili's reaction was quite fierce. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled gently. He didn't say anything else. He just kissed Anin. Mom won't be angry anymore if you coax her. The baby won't be angry either, okay? Bai Shuili then realized that he was just coaxing her because of Anin. She was so angry that she kicked his leg. He reached out and pressed her down. He looked straight into her eyes. You will lead Anin astray. She's fine. Bai Shuili's eyes were red. Yi Mulin smiled and leaned over to say something to Anin. He straightened up and looked at Bai Shuili again. Then he walked out and closed the door. The lounge was quiet. There were only the mother and daughter. Anin looked at Bai Shuili and moved her little body over. Bai Shuili looked at her. Numb. And Anne's little body crawled over and hugged her. She didn't say anything. She just hugged her. Her heart softened. She pressed her face against Anne's. She felt a little wronged and afraid. She said in a low voice, and Mom will be more careful in the future. And then whimpered and hugged her tightly. It was considered that they had reconciled. At noon, Yi Mulin asked Secretary Li to send lunch over. They ate in the small dining room. The lunch was rich, and there were desserts that children love to eat. Bai Shuili didn't think it was appropriate. She said while eating, I'll take him back later. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. Why? Don't you want to stay here? Are you afraid that others will gossip? You know it. Her voice was excited at first, but then it became softer. After all, she was afraid that Anin would hear something. Later, Bai Shuili felt that this topic was a little boring. She felt a little embarrassed and didn't continue. Yi Mulin looked at her and seemed to think for a moment. I'll ask the driver to send you back. I'll go back at night. It doesn't matter if you don't go. She added. Actually, it was only natural. Since Xiangnan was sick, even if he wasn't Xiangnan's father, he was still the one who raised him and was the father in name. As she said this, Yi Mulin looked at her strangely and then smiled. He didn't say whether he would reply or not. He just pinched Anin's little face and looked up at him. Yi Mulin smiled, hugged and kissed her. Daddy will be home tonight. He said go home. The meaning behind it was quite profound. He worked in the afternoon. Bai Shuili took Anin back in the chauffeur's car. When the chauffeur returned, Yi Mulin took the time to make a call. Have you sent her home? The driver nodded. Yes. Don't worry, Chief. He's already here. Yi Mulin hung up and immediately called Yi Mubai. Mubai, are you still in B City? Yi Mubai was at the airport and was about to return to the United States. As he walked, he asked, Brother, what's the matter? Chapter 36:54. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. Is Xiangnan sick? Yi Mubai nodded. I'm a little worried. I've been busy these days, so only when Yuan can take care of Xiangnan. Yi Mubai paused. Then I'll stay for a few more days. Yi Mubai smiled. That couldn't be better. After hanging up the phone, he dealt with the business for the whole afternoon. At 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, he went back to the villa to take some things and went to the hospital to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan was fine, but he needed to stay in the hospital for a few days. When he said goodbye to Wen Yuan, Yi Mubai happened to come over. Brother, won't you stay in the hospital to accompany Xiangnan tonight? Yi Mubai paused. No, I have a meeting in another city tomorrow, so I have to leave early in the morning. Yi Mubai looked at him and then at Wen Yuan. He always felt that the relationship between the couple was not that close, although he had seen them being intimate. He couldn't tell, but it was probably a man's intuition. He stood side by side with Wen Yuan and watched Yi Mubai's car drive away. Then his eyes fell on Wen Yuan's face. You won't keep him? Wen Yuan also withdrew her eyes and lightly looked at his face. He has a job. Yi Mubai didn't know what was wrong with him. but he felt that her reaction was too cold and emotionless. He frowned. Aren't you worried that he has a woman outside? Wen Yuan smiled lightly. He's very busy, so he may not have time. Yi Mubai's expression was slightly cold. Then you'll be the next my parents, and it will end with a divorce. Then he said sarcastically, do you love him? Or do you only love his power? Or is it just a marriage? Wen Yuan's voice was a little cold. Yi Mubai, you've crossed the line. She wanted to enter the ward, but Yi Mubai stopped her. He stared at her eyes and said in a low voice, was it also a task when you accompanied him to bed? Wen Yuan took 2 steps back and looked at him in surprise. Then she said in a hoarse voice, you have no right to ask, and I won't tell you. She walked around him, wanting to open the door. However, his hand covered the back of her hand as he crossed the line. Or do you think that apart from money, the only thing that a couple needs to maintain their relationship is sex? Even when Xiangnan is sick, he doesn't accompany you. Can't you ask him to? Wen Yuan turned and stared at him. After a long time, she said in a very soft voice, Yi Mubai, none of this has anything to do with you. If you continue to care about me like this, I'll think that you're seducing me. The one who seduced me was you. Yi Mubai took a step forward. Is it because he doesn't treat you well and doesn't care about you that you came up with the idea of seducing me to have sex and take revenge on him? Wen Yuan was stunned. Actually, it was just a misunderstanding during their first meeting, and she couldn't help herself. But for him to say this now, wasn't his brain a little too weird? And you're like a ridiculous actor, Wen Yuan. You don't even dare to fight for your own happiness. Yi Mubai chuckled. Yi Mubai chuckled. And you're like a ridiculous actor, Wen Yuan. You don't even dare to fight for your own happiness. He took out his phone and showed her a few photos. Did you go to the United States to escape from this? Chapter 3655. Yi Mubai stared at her and said, Bai Shuili is his ex-wife, isn't she? They have a child now. Wen Yuan, you sacrificed a lot to keep this marriage. Don't say anymore. Wen Yuan's lips were cold. It has nothing to do with you, nothing to do with it at all. Yi Mubai looked at her and said, Is it? Do you dare to say that you don't know? Do you dare to say that you're not afraid of divorce? She bit her lips. Because he was humiliated, he didn't say it directly, but the meaning he expressed couldn't be more obvious. It was nothing more than that there was no love between them, but she insisted on clinging to the position of Mrs. Yi and refused to let go. Wen Yuan looked at her and then smiled faintly. Divorce? After the divorce, will Yi Mubai marry me? Yes, you're right. I know he has a woman outside. He always has, and the one he loves isn't me. But so what? As long as I'm Mrs. Yi, I have everything. Yi Mubai's face was terrifyingly cold. He looked at this woman and felt that she was terribly vain. She was just like the women in his circle. She was a utilitarian, emotionless creature who only cared about fame and profit. Although he looked down on Wen Yuan, Yi Mubai liked Xiangnan very much and treated Xiangnan really well. He treated Wen Yuan like winter, but to Xiangnan, he was as warm as spring. However, in front of Xiangnan, his attitude towards Wen Yuan was very restrained. Wen Yuan didn't defend himself, but she seemed to have lost her confidence. Yi Mubai's impression of her was really terrible. Perhaps it was because he was full of vigilance against her like before, only making love and not making love. She remembered that he was schemed to have sex with her for the first time. Rather than saying that it was Yi Mulin who schemed against him, it was more like she schemed against him. It was her first time, but it wasn't his. But after drinking the spiked wine, it was as if he had eaten a jar of village medicine and almost killed her. The second day after, she couldn't walk for almost a day. When he woke up, he was furious. His face was dark, as though he could not accept the fact that he had slept with her. In his heart, she was Yi Mulin's fiancée and a woman who occupied his position. He felt unfair for Bai Shuili, and now that he had lost his memory, he still rejected her. Just like after they slept together again many times. The second time was when he was drunk and she went to his apartment to take care of him. Nothing happened that night, but the next morning, she took a shower before going to work and the bathroom door unexpectedly opened. Wen Yuan would never be able to forget the way Yi Mubai had looked at her. It had been very passionate. Later, he had walked over and pressed her against the wall, demanding her in a very rough manner. She didn't know if he was disgusted with her or self-abased, but he didn't kiss her lips. He just wanted to vent. Afterward, she collapsed on the bathroom floor while he took a shower and sat outside to smoke. By the time she left, there were already 7 or 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray in front of him. He treated her very badly. At that time, when Yuan felt that he was a lowly person. He was such a gentle person, but she didn't leave. Instead, she waited at the same spot. What was she expecting? She probably didn't know herself. She pulled her clothes and said that she was going to be late, so she had to leave. Yi Mubai reached out to hold her arm and pulled her into his arms. His voice was hoarse. Do it again. Chapter 36:56. Their real relationship started after that time. When Yuan knew that he didn't like her. Yi Mubai had a little princess in his heart named Lin Cece. Lin Cece's background was similar to Bai Xueli's, but after the Lin family was defeated, Lin Cece's father didn't go to jail. However, Lin Cece's life wasn't as good as Bai Xueli's. She only met Gu Zhe after wandering for so long and was badly hurt. When Yuan couldn't be jealous of Lin Cece, because she was someone who was on the same level as her and Mubai. Lin Cece and Gu Zhe never really separated because Gu Zhe didn't want to let go. When Yuan didn't know if Mubai was waiting for Lin Cece, but she knew that Mubai didn't like her. He had sex with her only because of his physical needs. Even, he hated her. Last time they were schemed against. Yi Mulin schemed against them, as she schemed against Mubai. This time, they had sex when they were both sober. After it was over, when Yuan lay on his shoulder, panting heavily. So did he. When everything calmed down, when Yuan said hoarsely, "I'm going to be late." She wanted to get up, but he held her waist and said in a hoarse voice, "I have something to say to you." Her body stiffened. After a while, she said, "Can we talk tonight?" Yi Mubai was still holding her down, but he let go of her after a while. When Yuan fell to the side, looking very embarrassed, he lit a cigarette and puffed out smoke for a long time before saying, "Come over tonight." When Yuan looked at him with a surprised and hurt expression. At night, she came over. His part-time worker left after cooking. When she saw Wen Yuan, her eyes were a little sad. Yi Mubai sat at the dining table and asked her to come over to eat. After Wen Yuan sat down, he didn't say anything and just ate quietly. She wanted to say something, but gave up after thinking about it. They ate together like this, and then he went to the study. Wen Yuan washed the dishes and followed him. Yi Mubai sat there and gestured for her to sit down. Then he said to her directly, "We can maintain our physical relationship until you and my brother get married, or when you're ready to have sex with him, we'll end it." Wen Yuan looked at him. In his cold eyes, she knew for the first time that he was not easy to talk to. She said softly, "What if I don't agree? Suit yourself." Yi Mubai took a puff of the cigarette and stared at her face. "If you don't want to, you can leave now. No one is forcing you, but..." He took out a box of medicine from the drawer. "I didn't take any protection this morning, so I took the medicine." He said it calmly, but when Yuan's entire body was ice cold. There was a hint of moisture in her eyes, but she couldn't say it out loud. She lowered her eyes and smiled faintly. "I understand." She took the box of medicine, opened it, and put the small pill in her mouth. The medicine dissolved, and it was very bitter. She swallowed it, and it was a little painful, just like the time he took her body. Done. She held the box of medicine in her hand, as if she was holding onto the last piece of driftwood, and walked out of the study. Yi Mubai stopped her. "Wen Yuan." She turned her head and looked at him. She thought that there was a hint of expectation in her eyes. He couldn't have missed it. Chapter 36:57. She was so embarrassed that she didn't say anything. He said again, "And I only like your body." He stood up from behind the desk and walked towards her. He walked straight to her and said, "You still have one choice, which is to gamble and break up with my brother. But I can't guarantee that I will marry you, and I can't guarantee that I will love you even after we get married." She said that Yi Mubai was a bastard. She even wanted to slap him. However, her hand was caught by him in the air. He held her hand and whispered, By Shueli, aren't you a jerk? You're even more slutty. You're with my brother while seducing me. You're afraid that after we get married, my brother won't be able to satisfy you without touching you. That's why you picked me and slept with me to satisfy your desires, right? She was even more embarrassed. He clearly knew that she liked him, but he still said such unbearable words to her. She pulled the door handle and wanted to leave, but her waist was caught by an arm, and she fell into his arms. He was very tall and easily restrained her. He lowered his head and buried his face in her neck and bit hard. Are you angry? Didn't sleeping with me satisfy your desires? Why are you crying now? He reached out and stroked her face. It was covered in cold tears. When you on, what kind of woman are you? While sleeping with me, you still appear with Mulin and the Yi clan, laughing and chatting with the elders, and even calling him Mulin so intimately. You were born to be an actor, weren't you? Not learning to be an actor is a waste of your good genes. He said in a mocking and sarcastic manner. Wen Yuan struggled. I'm a slut. I'm an actor. Why aren't you getting away from me? Yumubai, why are you hugging me? Let go of me. She struggled and screamed because he carried her to the sofa again and pinned her down with half of his body to prevent her from moving. She gasped and glared at the man above. Yumubai, you're so shameless. You look down on me and hate me, yet you're still pressing down on me. Because he pinned her down and freed one hand to gently stroke her face. His voice was hoarse. Because I like to play with you. His thin lips pressed against her ear, and he kissed there gently. A man likes a woman. One is true love, and the other is to sleep with her. Wen Yuan was stunned, and then she struggled violently and screamed, I don't want to. Do you know how loud and intoxicated you were when we did it in the bathroom this morning? Do you want to see how you do it with me before you decide whether you want to be my sister-in-law? After Yumubai finished speaking, he reached out and pressed a button. The entire bookcase on the opposite wall suddenly turned around, revealing an entire wall of mirrors behind it. The curtains of the floor-to-ceiling windows also slowly closed, and Yumubai was already unbuttoning his shirt. Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment before he pushed him away forcefully and ran toward the door. He quickly dragged her back and carried her directly to the mirror. Her clothes fell to the ground, and soon the study was filled with sounds of lovemaking after a long time. The blood burned, and everything calmed down. Yumubai was still hugging her from behind. He pressed his face against hers and forced her to look at the unbearable scene in the mirror. Did you see that? How did you respond to me just now? Are you sure you can still be my sister-in-law after we've done it? Chapter 3658. He said to give her a choice, so she gave him a choice. Wen Yuan was not an idiot. She knew very well that she and Yi Mulin were no longer engaged. If she slept with Yumubai, he would just be sleeping with her for free. He was doing this for Bai Shueli and Yi Mulin, and in his heart, she was a lowly woman with no integrity. After she asked, her chin was bitten by Yumubai. It was a heavy bite, and she almost screamed. Opening her eyes, she looked at him with tears hanging on her long eyelashes. She said in a low voice, Are you not willing? Actually, Wen Yuan knew her conditions. She was very good. If she was worthy of Yi Mulin, how could she not be worthy of Yumubai? He was not willing because he did not like her. He only liked her body and only liked to do it with her. This was what he said. Yumubai looked at Wen Yuan in the mirror. Just as she thought, she was very good enough to be a princess. The first time he did it with her, she was a virgin and had no experience. He could even feel that she did not even have the experience of a deep kiss. This was not strange because his brother would not touch her. She had always been a virgin and made herself an old lady. Wen Yuan and Yumubai were 30 years old when they had sex. However, because she had not experienced anything, she was still young and good-looking. She had a gentle temperament, but she gave Yumubai the feeling that she was scheming. He could not describe the feeling. Moreover, her attitude towards him was not cold, but it was seductive. He was not on guard and had sex with her. There were some things that they both knew. His brother wanted her to break off the engagement, and there was a condition for her to do so, which was for Yumubai to take over. No matter how stupid he was, he understood that her target had always been him. What a lunatic! He leaned against her face and stared at her. Do you think I would keep such a scheming woman by my side? Wen Yuan looked down and smiled. Then why did you still sleep with me? Physical needs. You can't be taking it seriously. He said insincerely. You are so wooden. The women outside are more interesting than you. Truth be told, he couldn't even deceive himself with these words. Wen Yuan's body was very soft. She was very fair and beautiful, and she took good care of herself. His fingers would melt wherever he went. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so beastly and wanted her a total of 4 times today. It was just that he had just done it, and now he wanted it again. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. Then you're not willing to marry me, are you? He stared into her eyes. I told you, we'll talk about this after you break off the engagement. When she opened her eyes again, she did not say anything but quietly put on her clothes. He thought she had rejected him, but later, when he was in B City, she would come over occasionally. Yimu Bai had never thought that her occasional visits were all on days when she was prone to getting pregnant, and that she had pierced a hole in the condom he had placed at the head of the bed. That time, when she came over, he happened to be meeting a B-list actress to discuss a contract. His assistant had just left, and the B-list actress seemed to have gone crazy. She thought that she would have to sleep with him just because she was acting, so she stripped to the point where she could not be seen. He had just tossed her clothes over when Yuan arrived. When she opened the door of the study, she was a little shocked. She looked at them like a wife caught in the act of adultery. Chapter 36:59. Then why was she looking at him with such a gaze? It was as though he had done something terribly wrong. There was no need for him to explain himself to her, but he didn't want to sleep with that second-rate. Hence, he asked the second-rate to take his clothes and leave. Wen Yuan wanted to leave too, but she didn't say anything. In the end, it was Yimu Bai who dragged him back. He looked into her eyes. Why did you come back? Wen Yuan pursed his lips tightly, a resolute expression on his face. She looked at the tips of her shoes and chuckled. I won't come back again. Yimu Bai furrowed his brows and looked at her. Wen Yuan pushed his hand away and took a step back. Yimu Bai, in your heart, I'm no different from these women, right? He suddenly felt a little frustrated and placed his hand in his pocket. She chuckled again. That's right. How can you think highly of a woman who sent herself over for you to play with? She raised her head and looked at him. Yimu Bai, actually you're right. I do like you. Everything I did was to get close to you, including my engagement with your brother. You think I'm crazy, but how is Yi Mulin any better? You clearly know that we're fake. You think I'm using him, but he's not using me. From another perspective, I'm helping him, but why would I help him? It's all because of you, you bastard. After when Yuan said that, she pushed him away and wanted to run. He grabbed her wrist to stop her from running. His voice was extremely hoarse. Wen Yuan, speak clearly. But before he could understand, the second-rate came out with his clothes on and a condom in his hand. He gulped. Director Yi, I found this condom in the bedside cabinet. It seems to have a hole in it. There's a big box of condoms over there that have all been pierced. Yimu Bai was stunned. Then his gaze landed on Wen Yuan's face, and he asked softly, You pierced it? Wen Yuan didn't say anything, but his face was pale. Yimu Bai spoke again. You want to get pregnant with my child? She didn't deny it. Yimu Bai narrowed his eyes. Wen Yuan, you crazy woman, do you know what you are doing? Do you think I will marry you just because you are pregnant? I'm pregnant. If you don't marry Yi Mulin, you have to. Her voice was calm, as if she had thought about it 1,000 times. As soon as she finished speaking, Yimu Bai slapped her in the face. He was usually the most gentle person, but this was the first time he hit a woman, and the woman he hit was a woman who was related to him. He grabbed her hand and said angrily, Follow me. The second-string actor was so scared that he peed his pants. His legs were weak because he recognized that this woman was a celebrity. She was Yi Mulin's fiancée, which meant that she was Director Ye's future sister-in-law. They were actually having an affair. The second-rate prostitute gulped. Yimu Bai swept her out and got into his car with Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan shrank in the back seat of the car. Yimu Bai, where are you taking me? Go to the hospital, he said shortly. I want to check if you're pregnant. Wen Yuan screamed. You're crazy. I don't want to go. However, He steeled his heart and ignored her. He directly made a call and found an expert to wait for him. He drove over and dragged her to the examination room. They did an ultrasound, urine test, and blood test to prove that she was not pregnant. After everything was done, Wen Yuan refused to get into his car at the entrance of the hospital. She just looked at him and kept backing away until she got into a taxi. After that, Wen Yuan did not look for him again. He knew that she was probably scared and gave up, until one day, he drank too much and drove to Wen Yuan's apartment. He knocked on her door, and when she came out, she was only wearing a bathrobe, as if she had just taken a shower. He was drunk and pushed her in, forcing himself on her twice without protection. In the end, he sobered up and seemed to regret it. He slowly let go of her and did not even finish. He lay down at the side and only turned to her after a long time. Wen Yuan, I'm sorry, I drank too much. Wen Yuan curled up in the corner of the sofa, her bathrobe hanging on her body. Her exposed skin was green and purple, accusing him of being rough just now. Yi Mubai looked at her for a long time and finally wrote her a check for 10 million yuan. He left, and when Yuan tore the check into pieces. Pieces of the check floated down, she laughed. It was great that he thought of her as a prostitute. After that incident, they did not care about each other. She did not take the initiative to contact him either. She did not have the mood or energy to scheme against a man later on. She felt unwell and went to the hospital. Before she could get a checkup, she met Yi Mubai. Lin Cece was sick. He would talk to Lin Cece, and when Lin Cece smiled, he would smile even more happily. At that time, Bai Shuili thought that he would actually love someone. He just did not love her. He just hated her. Chapter 3660. When Yuan just stood there and looked at him quietly. Lin Cece didn't look well. She was probably feeling unwell, so he helped her up. The concern and love in his eyes couldn't be hidden. It was something that Wen Yuan had always wanted. She thought about it. They had done it many times, but he had never shown any warmth to her. It was so obvious that he hated her. She thought that she didn't feel pain. She thought that in the world of love, she only needed one person to contribute. She just needed to look at him. But now, she realized that a one-man show was actually so laughable and heartbreaking. This was especially so for her. When she was feeling unwell or sick, she also needed someone by her side. But she couldn't do anything. She could only continue walking forward, pretending that she didn't see them, pretending that she wasn't hurt. Yi Mubai still saw Wen Yuan. He stared at her and gently let go of Lin Cece. I'll go. Lin Cece and Bai Shuili were so close. How could she not know Wen Yuan? But she only knew him in the past and didn't know him. But looking at Yi Mubai's expression now, why did she feel that there was something going on between Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan? Sister-in-law and brother-in-law. Just thinking about it made her excited. Lin Cece had coincidentally said goodbye to Lao Bai. He was going to Yunnan, so he had tea with her. But she had diarrhea, so Lao Bai sent her over. She didn't expect to meet Wen Yuan. But the way Wen Yuan looked at Lao Bai, it was like a story was written in every minute. Yi Mubai patted Lin Cece's arm gently. I'll send you back later. It's okay, Mubai, I'm much better. Lin Cece smiled brightly. She waved at him and said deliberately, go and see your sister-in-law. Yi Mubai glanced at her. He wasn't sure if Lin Cece knew anything. But in the end, he didn't say anything and quickly chased after Wen Yuan. He caught up to Wen Yuan at the elevator and dragged her out. Why are you here? Wen Yuan stared at him for a long time before saying slowly, I'm not feeling well. His lips moved as if he wanted to ask something, but he didn't. Wen Yuan broke free from his embrace and said quietly, if there's nothing else, I'm going up. I have an appointment with a specialist. Yi Mubai pursed his lips and didn't say anything. In the end, Wen Yuan still entered the elevator. When the elevator doors closed, neither of them thought that this might be the last time they would see each other in this lifetime. When Yi Mubai returned, Lin Cece was already gone. He looked at the time and rushed to catch his plane. Wen Yuan, on the other hand, was lining up for a checkup in the hospital's long corridor. He felt nauseous and wanted to vomit. It took him a long time to go from the gastroenterology department to the internal medicine department. Finally, an older doctor said, "There's no problem. Miss Wen, why don't you go to the obstetrics department?" Obstetrics, not gynecology. Wen Yuan froze, his fingers clutching his bag tightly. After a long time, he finally asked in a low voice, "What do you mean?" The middle-aged female doctor's tone was gentle. "Miss Wen may be a mother." Many people knew that Wen Yuan was Yi Mulin's fiancée. It wasn't strange that she had a child. Therefore, the doctor congratulated her. Wen was. And she was. Like a zombie, she walked to the obstetrics and gynecology department. In front of her, there was a long line of women. They all had big bellies and happy smiles on their faces. Chapter 36-61. She might be pregnant, but could she be as happy as them? She didn't queue up. She escaped from the hospital as if she was escaping. She secretly bought a pregnancy test at the pharmacy. In the bathroom of the bathroom, she saw the legendary 2 lines. She scratched her hair and sat on the floor of the bathroom. She put her face in her arms. She was pregnant. When she was about to give up on Yi Mubai, the baby, it should be that night when he drank too much and almost raped her. He drank too much, so he didn't take any protection. That day was also her safe period, so she didn't take any medicine. She was pregnant. It was Yi Mubai's child. In fact, he was the only man she had. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. She had no strength in her whole body. From day to night, she maintained the same action. She just looked at the phone. At 10 o'clock in the evening, she called Yi Mubai's phone. He picked up after a long time. Wen Yuan hugged herself with one hand and called his name softly. "Mubai, if..." On the other side of the phone, Yi Mubai frowned and then said in a low voice, "What's the matter?" Wen Yuan lowered her eyes and said softly, "If I break up with him publicly and say that I've always liked you, will you be willing to marry me?" Without waiting for him to answer, she said hurriedly, "I only have you as a man. There really is no one else." Yi Mubai was silent for a while and then said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, you're not young anymore. You're not a little girl anymore. Can you be more mature and rational? We can't be together just because you broke up with my brother. You can marry someone else, but if you marry me, the consequences will be very serious." What will happen? Wen Yuan's emotions were a little unstable. Will it make you unhappy? Will it make you not want to go home? Yi Mubai, if you don't like me, why do you sleep with me again and again? It's a consensual thing. Yi Mubai's voice seemed ruthless in the dark night. Wen Yuan, don't be childish. This world is not something you can get just because you like it. It's the same for me. Let's both be more mature, okay? She was still stunned, but she seemed to understand something. Yi Mubai might never like her. She hung up without saying anything about her pregnancy. After hanging up the phone, the night was still dark. She didn't turn on the lights, so she cried in the dark. She had brought this upon herself. He was partly responsible for the child's accident, but it was also her own carelessness. She had once wanted his child so badly, but now she was so afraid of his arrival. Wen Yuan stayed at home the whole time. The next day, she didn't go to work. She forgot about the time and everything. She only snapped back to reality when it started pouring outside. However, when she picked up her phone to call Yi Mubai to tell him about her pregnancy, she couldn't get through. She frantically searched for him. She called him hundreds of times, but his phone was still turned off. She looked for Yi Mulin. She tried everything she could, but all she got was Yi Mubai's broken phone. She had really thought that he was dead, but he was still alive. He had lost his memory, but he still hated her. Wen Yuan looked at Yi Mubai and slowly came back from his memories. A bitter smile appeared at the corner of his lips. Yes, he still hated her. Actually, she didn't care that much anymore. He hadn't been by her side for so many years. She was fine, and so was Xiangnan. Maybe he just couldn't accept it. Maybe it was because he had lost his memory that she wanted to take advantage of the situation. But when he thought about it, would he be disgusted and say that she was scheming and shameless? This book came from Chapter 36-62. Wen Yuan thought about it, and a bitter expression appeared on her face. She didn't know if she was wrong, whether it would have been better not to go to America, whether it would have been better to give up. Yi Mubai went over and sat by the bedside. Perhaps it was because of the nature of father and son that Xiangnan was especially close to him. Yi Mubai sat and Xiangnan leaned against his leg. Initially, he refused to eat anything for the whole day, but now that Yi Mubai fed him, he ate obediently. Wen Yuan felt a little complicated watching this. Yi Mubai coaxed Xiangnan to eat and read a children's book to the little boy. After all, he was a sick and weak child, so Xiangnan fell asleep after a while. Yi Mubai tucked Xiangnan in and then looked at Wen Yuan. His tone was a little faint. "You're not eating? I'm not hungry." Wen Yuan looked down. "Thank you." Yi Mubai stood up and walked towards her. She was at the junction between the ward and the washroom. He walked over step by step and forced her against the door. His voice was low and hoarse as he said, "Wen Yuan, what kind of tricks are you playing now? If you think that a married woman will fall for this trick, then you're too childish." Her body was pressed against him, and she couldn't move at all. She closed her eyes against the door. "I didn't. So what if you didn't?" He stared at her face. At such a close distance, he could see that her skin was very fine, so fine that there were almost no pores. There was only a circle of fine hair, and he could also see that she lived a comfortable life. Yi Mubai stretched out a hand and touched her face gently. It was a little too much, and she was very afraid. Her lips were trembling and her eyes were closed. His fingertips touched her lips, and his voice was hoarse. "You look like you're intoxicated now, right?" As he said that, his face was almost touching hers, and his voice was even hoarser, trembling, inexplicably sexy. "Or is it because my brother doesn't touch you, so you want to use other men to satisfy you? Stop talking." Wen Yuan opened his eyes and gritted his teeth. "I'm your sister-in-law. A man belongs to where his heart is." Yi Mubai smiled mockingly and slowly straightened his body. "You just don't want to admit it." Wen Yuan was still leaning against the door. She suddenly closed her eyes and laughed softly. She laughed so hard that her chest heaved up and down. It was really quite seductive. "Even if Yuchio wasn't satisfied, I would look for anyone but you, Yi Mubai." Wen Yuan opened his eyes and looked at him. "So, don't look at me as if I'll pounce on you at any time." Yi Mubai's expression turned even uglier. "That better be the case." Wen Yuan's eyes were a little hot. She quickly lowered her eyes and did not look at him. Her heart was a little cold. She felt that she might have been wrong. She shouldn't have gone to America. She wanted to give up on him now. She thought. She thought. Yi. She thought. She thought. She. It. She thought. Yi. 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 However, she didn't dare to disclose the news of her divorce. Otherwise, the Wen family, including her parents, would not let her go. And Xiangnan's identity, she clenched her fists. It seemed that she had no way out. Maybe she was just like what Yi Mubai thought. She was a scheming woman. He did not know why. He had forgotten everything. He could be friendly to everyone, including Bai Shiuli and Bai Shiuli's child, but he could not be friendly to Wen Yuan. He subconsciously rejected this woman, and even he could not explain it. He didn't know why. He forgot everything. He could be friendly to everyone, including Bai Shiuli and Bai Shiuli's child, but he just couldn't be friendly to Wen Yuan. He subconsciously rejected this woman. He couldn't say it himself. He took the lead to enter the small dining room. Wen Yuan frowned. "Yi Mubai, you don't feel comfortable if you don't insult others?" "I feel uncomfortable when I look at you." He said it straightforwardly. Then he frowned again. "You acted really well the night I stayed in the villa." Wen Yuan immediately thought of what happened that night. She bit her lips. "I don't understand what you mean." "You don't understand?" Yi Mubai sneered again. "My brother has a woman outside. How can he be so intimate with you? I heard that he lives outside, right?" "Enough." Wen Yuan said awkwardly, "You don't have to worry about my business. I won't seduce you. Don't worry." Then she started to eat. Actually, Wen Yuan was quite good-looking, and she was the kind of woman that was suitable for IKEA. She was dignified and gentle, definitely not the flirtatious and cheap type. Only Yi Mubai would think that way when he saw her. They ate the meal in silence. He didn't speak. She didn't speak either. She cleaned up the dishes and walked to the balcony. She knew that Yi Mubai was behind her. She said, "There's someone in my heart. I've liked him for a long time, but he doesn't like me." So, she turned her head and looked at Yi Mubai quietly. What you said doesn't exist. I just mistook you for someone else at the concert that day. Please don't misunderstand. We can't get along if this goes on. Yimubai laughed dryly and stood there casually. If that's the case, I should be relieved. You won't try to climb into my bed when you go to America, right? Wen Yuan looked down and said softly, yes. Even if I divorce your brother, I won't climb into your bed. Don't worry. You want to find a foreign devil? Do you think they can satisfy you? Yimubai frowned and asked softly. Wen Yuan was furious. She turned around and walked away. When she passed by him, he grabbed her wrist and swung her over. She fell right into his arms. Warm, firm, familiar. At that moment, Wen Yuan wanted to cry. She thought he was dead when he disappeared. She cried for so long when she was pregnant with his child. He didn't know that he had forgotten everything when he came back. He was so mean to her, and she cried too. Now that she was in his arms, she wanted to cry too. She was reluctant, but she forced herself to leave his arms. Her hand was on his shoulder, but it slid down to his heart. The more she pushed against him, the tighter he held her. Yimubai's voice was tense. Look at you. You said you don't want to seduce me. Huh? This book is from. Chapter 36-63. Wen Yuan was extremely embarrassed. She turned her face to the side. Let go of me. Xiangnan is here. Thinking that when isn't here, you can mess around with other men? Is that what you mean? He moved closer to her ear and asked in a low and husky voice. What kind of logic was that? Wen Yuan struggled with all her might. It would have been better if she hadn't struggled, but once she did, Yimubai couldn't take it anymore. He whispered in her ear, Wen Yuan, don't move anymore. Because he was having a reaction, Wen Yuan froze for a moment. She bit her lip, feeling a little embarrassed. After a long time, she whispered, let go of me. Yimubai suddenly said, I was wrong. His hot body hugged her tightly, and his thin lips pressed against her ear. It turns out that I also have a desire for a married woman. He lowered his head, but didn't do anything. He just stuck close to her. Wen Yuan said softly, Yimubai, we've crossed the line. Yimubai's hand was on her stomach. He tightened his grip. Wen Yuan, do you still have any morals? Shouldn't a woman with morals push me away? As he said that, he chuckled in a low voice. Then, his hand went under her sweater. Wen Yuan groaned. Yimubai, what are you doing? Take your hand away. Don't touch that. But he persisted. He hugged her and stared at her. Don't want it? But I think you really want it. He retracted his finger and smiled wickedly. Then, he went to the bathroom to wash up. Wen Yuan's legs went limp. She almost couldn't stand. Her breath was hot, tainted with Yimubai's scent. She felt a little ashamed. It was actually very humiliating for him to treat her like that, but she still had a reaction. He must have looked down on her. Wen Yuan's hand clutched her shirt. She curled up on the balcony and looked at the night sky outside. The night breeze blew, but her eyes were hot. She felt like crying. She had liked the man for so long. She had waited for so long, but he hated her. Wen Yuan stood alone in the night, feeling lonely. Yimubai came out of the washroom and looked at her. Are you angry? I'm not angry. Wen Yuan turned his head. His long hair draped over his shoulders, and half of his face was hidden in his jet black hair. It was fair and beautiful. She looked at Yimubai and said softly, Yimubai, just now you said you were wrong. Actually, I was wrong. A faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I'll take care of Xiangnan myself. You can go back. Don't worry, I won't appear in front of you in the future, nor will I seduce you. Yimubai frowned. What do you mean? Wen Yuan raised his head and smiled. That's exactly what I meant. I won't trouble you anymore, so please don't treat me like that. She was wrong. From the beginning, she shouldn't have had any illusions about him. After Wen Yuan said that, Yimubai smiled and placed his hand in his pocket. Not bad. You're very self-aware. That's all. It's best that you don't trouble me anymore. With that said, he looked as though he was going to take out a cigarette. But after that, he walked out to smoke. Yimubai stood in the corridor. His long fingers pinched the cigarette, but gently as he raised his head and squinted his eyes. Actually, what they said wasn't right. It wasn't normal for him to have feelings for her. In the past, when it came to his girlfriends or other women, There had been female celebrities who had sent them to his bed, but he had never touched them. Book from Chapter 3664. But when Yuan was different, he wanted to bully her. Was there something wrong with him? Did he like other people's wives? Or was it because she was his sister-in-law that she brought him a forbidden excitement? Or was when Yuan himself very attractive? He couldn't tell. He only knew that his mind was filled with the image of her curling up in his arms like a shrimp, crying no, no. He felt like he was going to explode. He put out the cigarette. Maybe he should find a woman. Then he wouldn't have to fantasize about an annoying woman all day long. He stood outside for a long time. Late at night, he pushed the door open and went in. In the dim ward, Xiangnan fell asleep. She was lying sideways in Wen Yuan's arms. It was a very warm scene. It also gave Yi Mubai a very beautiful feeling. It was like something that was missing was put together again. He looked at it quietly for a long time. Later, he lay on the sofa and still looked at it like this, unwilling to leave. He must be sick and possessed. Asterisk on the other side of the city, in a high-class apartment. Yi Mulin, who had been busy for the whole day, helped by Ainan's little friend take a bath. He wrapped her in a white bath towel and placed her on her little bed. As a father, he helped her wipe her and said seriously, "Ainan, do you know that you were wrong?" By Ainan looked at her papa, her expression indescribable. Wasn't she safe today? Why did Papa mention this to her now? By Ainan silently swallowed her saliva. "I was wrong, Mama. I was wrong." There were complicated emotions in Yi Mulin's eyes. He didn't know whether he should be happy or unhappy. It was obvious that Ainan was avoiding the important and dwelling on the trivial. He didn't know who she got her cleverness from. He wasn't that naughty, and Bai Shuili probably wasn't that smart when she was young. Thinking of this, Yi Mulin's heart was filled with pride. He couldn't explain this feeling, but his identity as a strict father made him decide to hit her little p******. He put his hand over and coughed lightly. "Why didn't you say that it was Mama's call?" Ainan lay on her stomach with her little face buried in the pillow. She half turned her face and said with a strong desire to live, "Because I miss Daddy." These few words seemed to be magical. The man who was about to teach Bai Ainan a lesson suddenly felt reluctant. He lowered his head and kissed the little fellow. "Okay, Daddy won't hit you anymore," and got up, hugged his neck, and said affectionately, "Daddy is the best." He was speechless. He didn't know if it was a good thing for him to spoil her like this. He didn't seem to have any principles. Yi Mulin thought for a while and decided to let his daughter make the decision. "Dad always has to fight one. And do you think you should fight Mom or Anne?" Yi Mulin's fingers rested on her little shoulder, and then he couldn't help but touch her back. Her little body was extremely cute, and he couldn't bear to let go. He flipped her over and over like a little doll, kissing her again and again, and then allowed him to kiss her, and finally said with some disgust, "Dad, you're so perverted." "Pervert? Did I?" He thought that he was only perverted towards Bai Shuili. Yi Mulin smiled and kissed the little girl, coaxing her to sleep as soon as possible. Before Ainan fell asleep, she looked at him eagerly. "Dad, do you really want to hit Mom's p******? Yi Mulin chuckled and reached out to touch her little head. "Then, Dad, can I punish you in another way?" Bai Shuili, who was in the study, shivered all over. This book came from Chapter 3665. I just want to make you cry after coaxing the little girl. Yi Mulin rubbed his waist and walked into the master bedroom. There was no one inside. It was empty. He frowned and looked at the time. It was already past 10 o'clock. What was Bai Shuili busy with? He went to the study and saw her lying there, translating. "Don't look so close, or you'll be short-sighted." He walked over and pulled her hair. Bai Shuili looked up at him, then lowered her head and muttered, "I'm past the age of short-sightedness, okay? That's old." Yi Mulin's face darkened, and he held her chin. "Get up. You're so annoying." Bai Shuili was working. She thought he was annoying, so she subconsciously hid his hand. Yi Mulin glared at her, but Bai Shuili didn't know anything. He stared at her for a long time. In the end, Yi Mulin went out and took a shower in the master bedroom. Then he leaned against the bed and flipped through a magazine. He was waiting for her. He was a little impatient. It was almost 12 o'clock, and she was still working, so he got up and walked to the study. Baishuali was still working as before. He looked at the door for a while, then returned to the master bedroom. This time, he took out his documents to read. After a long time, it was almost 1 o'clock. He really couldn't wait any longer, so he went straight to the study and opened the door. Baishuali was shocked. She turned around and looked at him. "You're not asleep yet?" He stared at her, then reached out and picked her up. He closed her computer and said, "Go to sleep." "No, Yimulin, if you want to sleep, you can sleep by yourself." She was speechless. She hit his shoulder and said, "Go to sleep. Don't worry about me." He stared at her and said slowly, "I can't sleep alone." Baishuali was speechless, but she was afraid of falling. She could only put her arms around his shoulders and let him carry her back to the master bedroom. He pressed her against the soft bed, kissed her for a while, and touched the corner of her mouth. "Do you want to take a shower, or do you want to do it first?" She came back to herself from the kiss. She blushed and turned away. Yimulin, she remembered that he wouldn't let her. She could only bite her lips weakly. "We can take care of it together, but I don't want to have a relationship with you." "But I want to." He leaned close to her ear and bit it gently. "We're living together and sleeping together. Do you think we'll have sex?" "Baishuali, did you go to America and your brain is filled with Westerners?" She bit his neck angrily. "You're too hateful. If you dare to do anything, I won't let you off." He chuckled. "Why won't you let me go?" As he spoke, he said a few vulgar words in a low voice. Her ears turned red. Yimulin chuckled again. "Baishuali, I won't let you go before you let me go." As he spoke, he began to grope her. Baishuali had no choice. She turned her face to the side and said in a sobbing voice, "Yimulin, let me go." I don't want to. I want to." He kissed her, and his eyes were deep and locked on her. It was as if there was magic that made her unable to say no more. As he kissed her, he murmured, and then said that I can't hit your butt anymore. I thought about it for a long time, but I couldn't think of a better punishment, so he smiled and kissed her. Does it hurt? I'll update it tomorrow. End of this chapter. Chapter 3666. Her black hair was scattered on the white sheets. Her face was buried in the pillow. Her hands were clenched into fists in her mouth, and her shoulders were trembling slightly. She looked pitiful no matter how you looked at it. Yimulin pulled her hand away and kissed her. His voice was low and hoarse. "I really don't want you to cry like this to seduce me. Don't say it." Her face was full of tears, and she bit her lips. "Yimulin, you bastard." "Yes, I'm a bastard. I didn't abandon you. What's wrong with me being a bastard? Am I a bastard for doing this to you? Who will compensate me for all these years, huh?" The more he said, the more he wanted to kill her. Baishuali cried a lot. Yimulin let out a sigh of relief and coaxed her in her ear. "And I heard you crying like this." She asked her mother what happened. "What did you say? Did you tell her that you were beaten by your father?" As he spoke, his voice was full of yuwang, which made him look very bad. Baishuali couldn't stand him like this. She burst into tears. "Yimulin, you're so bad. Didn't you know on the first day you married me, huh?" He smiled warmly against her, and then he stopped teasing her. He only cared about plundering and possessing her. He didn't let her go until midnight. Baishuali felt that her waist was about to break. She buried her face in the pillow and couldn't stop crying. Yimulin leaned against her and stroked her shoulder with some satisfaction. After a while, he leaned over and kissed her face. "Are you uncomfortable? Why are you crying like this?" Her face was buried in the pillow, and her voice was vague. "It's none of your business." These were the words of wealth. He followed her and kissed her again, making her gasp for breath. She turned her head and glared at him. "Yimulin, what else do you want? We've already done it. If you want more, I don't have the strength to accompany you anymore." Yimulin smiled in a deep voice. "I'll take you to take a bath. Don't you hate not being clean?" She lay on her stomach and didn't move. He reached out and picked her up easily. As he hugged her, he realized that she was thinner than before. His eyes darkened. She had suffered a little. Baishuali really had no strength, so she let him do it. She gently closed her eyes and felt that she was placed in the warm water. It was very comfortable. She softly snorted and lay on the edge of the bathtub. Yulin leaned over and rubbed her back, gently wiping her body. The warm water and his perfect service made by Shiuli want to sleep. She lay on her stomach and lowered her guard. Yulin's voice suddenly rang in her ears. Have you thought about me all these years? She groaned vaguely and did not open her eyes. He continued to speak in a hoarse voice. Do you miss me hugging you? This time she woke up and rolled over to look at him. Perhaps because it was nighttime, or perhaps because her mind was empty after doing it, she was not as guarded as she was during the day. She just hugged his neck. What about you? He lowered his head and kissed her. After a long while, he said in a hoarse voice, What do you think? Bai Shiuli secretly clenched her fists. Don't do it again. I'm tired. Carry me to rest. His dark eyes stared at her. After a long time, he still carried her back to the master bedroom. She lay there sleeping, and he took a dry towel to dry her wet hair bit by bit. After he was done, he looked at her sleeping face and thought silently that she was actually still avoiding it. Perhaps she was still angry. Of course he was angry, but it seemed that he couldn't get angry with her. This book came from Chapter 3667. In the past, he couldn't sleep when she wasn't around. Now that she was around, he still couldn't fall asleep. Then, the man who was almost 40 years old felt a little wronged. He pressed his face against her shoulder and bit down hard. Once was not enough. However, he also knew that he had done it for 2 hours at a time. If he did it again, she might really be injured. He flipped her flat and let out a long breath. He was ready to go to the gym to exercise. However, after he went out, he went to Anne's room to take a look. In the pink and blue room, the child was sleeping soundly. Her posture was the same as her mother's. She was lying on her stomach with her little face buried in the pillow. Yulin's heart softened. The last bit of hope in his heart was shattered by familial love and disappeared completely. He lowered his head and kissed the little fellow. However, Anne woke up. She opened her little eyes and looked at her father. She turned over and nestled her little body over. Daddy hug. Hence, Yulin had originally planned to go to the gym. At this moment, he resigned himself to his fate and coaxed his little daughter. However, the little thing with the milky fragrance in his arms was especially comfortable. It even had a hypnotic effect. He thought that he would have to keep his eyes open for the whole night. In the end, he fell asleep first. Anne stared at him. She first pinched his face and then stared at him for a long time. Finally, she secretly kissed him. She liked her father. She nestled in her father's arms. Her little body had to be in his arms. This was very important. This was a must. Her little head had to be tucked under her father's chin and neck. This was so that her father could easily kiss her little head when he lowered his head. After adjusting, Anne went to sleep happily. At night, she had a dream. She dreamt of a big gray wolf and a little white rabbit getting married in a big forest. They gave birth to a little white rabbit who was very beautiful. The little white rabbit was called Anne. Anne had a beautiful dream. She laughed so hard that she was about to wake up. She did not wake up. Yulin woke up, looking at his little lover who was laughing so hard in his arms. He lowered his head and kissed the little fellow. His mind emptied again, and he fell into a deep sleep amidst the milky fragrance. Shiuli was the first to wake up in the morning. It was not even 7 o'clock. It was already dawn. When she opened her eyes, she felt that her whole body was sore. She lay on Shunin and greeted Yulin's family. Then she got up. He was not around. She had to see in and make breakfast for the children. As for the man who forced himself on her last night, he was not in her consideration. Shiuli sat up and realized that she only had a black shirt on, and it was Yulin's. He probably wouldn't wear this color anymore, so why did he keep it? She didn't change either. She just put on a nightgown and walked towards Anne's room. As soon as she pushed the door open, she saw the father and daughter hugging each other affectionately. Even their breathing was the same. She stood by the door. She suddenly felt a lump in her throat, and her feelings were complicated. She wanted to leave him. The reason why she was not firm was because of Anne. Anne liked him very much. She was naturally willing to be close to him. It was as if he was born to be her father, and did not need to transition at all. Baishiwali felt like a dog in her heart. Was it because he was particularly good-looking that Anan liked him so much? Just when she wanted to leave, the man had already woken up. His black eyes silently locked on her eyes, and he said in a low and hoarse voice, "Come here." Baishiwali took a step back. "I'll make breakfast. I'll make breakfast. You sleep with Anan for a while." He had already stood up. This book comes from Chapter 3668. "I just want to make you cry, oh," Baishiwali replied. Looking at the sportswear on his body, she was a little puzzled. He naturally saw her eyes and glared at her. Without saying anything, he just picked her up and put her next to Anan, rubbing her a few times. "Don't do this." She bit her lip. "Anan will wake up." His expression was a little strange. "How about we go back to the room?" She glared at him. "Yulin, why do you always think about this kind of thing?" As soon as she finished speaking, she let out a low cry because he had picked her up and carried her all the way back to the master bedroom. Baishiwali bit her lips. "What are you doing?" He lowered his head and kissed her. "I have to go to work later, so I don't have time to do it. But you're right. I think about it all day long. I think about it when I come home at night, and I think about it when I go to work during the day. I'm always thinking about how to do you." She turned her face away shyly. "You're too shameless." Her face was so red that it looked like it was going to drip blood. Yulin squinted at her and touched her lips gently. "Don't you miss me? Why don't I check?" She wouldn't because women couldn't stand being teased at all. It was impossible for her to not react to him like this. He didn't force her, but he smiled warmly, meaning that any adult would understand. She turned her face away and didn't want to talk to him. Yulin looked at her and was about to get up, but she stopped him. "Wait a minute. I have something to say." He looked at her. Baishiwali sat up from the bed and looked at him. "Shouldn't you be with Yuan?" He stared at her, and her face was a little hot. She didn't dare to look at him, so she just lowered her face. "After all, you're husband and wife, and you raised Xiangnan." Yulin stared at her with a deep look in his eyes, and she couldn't understand it. After a long time, he asked her in a low voice, "Do you really think I should accompany Yuan and Xiangnan? Shouldn't a normal person let Xiangnan recognize Mubai?" She couldn't say anything for a moment. Yulin smiled again and didn't say anything else. He got up and said, "I'll make breakfast." She suddenly took his hand. He looked at her and said coldly, "You're not going to urge me to find Yuan anymore?" Baishiwali licked her lips and looked at him. "I don't know what you're thinking." His fingers gently stroked her face as he leaned in and said in a husky voice, "I'm thinking that you're as stupid as a pig." She exploded in anger and glared at him. This time, he really left and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Baishiwali was startled for a moment, but she still ran over unwillingly. He skillfully made breakfast. She stared at him. "What did you mean just now?" Yulin cut his toast and said calmly, "Baishiwali, let me tell you, my fire hasn't been vented yet. Are you sure you want to seduce me by dressing like this?" He pulled her into his arms and bit her ear. "I won't take responsibility if you piss me off." Startled, she took several steps back and glared at him. He looked at her and said very slowly, "You asked me what I think. I can tell you." As he said that, he put down the toast in his hand and smiled faintly. "I've endured not having a woman for 2 or 3 years. Of course, I want to do it with the rest of my body." Baishiwali's eyes widened, and then she ran away. There was a man's evil laughter behind her. When she returned to the bedroom, she thought about his words and suddenly thought of something. When Yuan hadn't done it before? Was that why he always seemed to have taken a can of village medicine? End of this chapter. Chapter 3669. She was in a daze for a long time. Yulin was done preparing breakfast. He ate a little and went back to the room to change. After changing, he looked at the girl who was still in a daze. So he smiled. "What are you thinking about?" She looked up at him, her lips moving, but she didn't say anything. "Don't dare to ask." He looked at her. "Baishiwali, apart from being a stupid pig, you're also a coward." She bit her lips. "I'm not a coward." He didn't argue with her. He just smiled and kissed her lips. "Is it so hard to admit that you're possessive of me? Is it so hard to admit that you're overjoyed now?" She was a little angry at being exposed. She turned her face away and didn't let him kiss her. But he had kissed her. Yulin's voice was hoarse. I'll come back early tonight. Don't run around with an anymore. Why don't you hire an auntie? She was a little confused. She knew that his suggestion was good, but she hadn't thought about it yet. She couldn't decide if she should be with him. After all, there were some moral restraints. Yumula knew exactly what she was thinking in her heart. He just smiled and reached out to caress her face. Without saying anything, he muttered, "By Shueli, am I that kind of man in your heart? Think about it carefully. Also, I'm still angry." She watched him walk out in a daze. Then, she punched the blanket. Why was he angry? She didn't do it on purpose. What did she do? She was raped as soon as she came back. What else did he want? Baishuli bit her lips angrily. She felt wronged. He told her to be obedient. She didn't want it. So, after she woke up she left the apartment with an in. She dragged a small suitcase to her parents' place. She believed that he wouldn't dare to do anything to her parents, even if he found her. She drove herself and then asked uneasily in the back seat, "Mom, are we not going to live with Dad anymore?" Baishuli found a hard answer. She thought about it and said, "We're going to stay with Grandpa and Grandma for a few days." "Oh," she said quietly. "Mom, does Dad have another child?" Bainan was quite disappointed. She wasn't her dad's only child. She was quite bothered by this. Perhaps this was the possessiveness of a child. Baishuli was also stunned for a moment, and then she softly agreed. She was afraid that Anne would ask about illegitimate children again. If that happened, she wouldn't know what to say. However, Bainan only responded with an "oh" and did not ask further. Baishuli's mood was a little complicated. She didn't know what to do now, so that Anne could have a normal environment to grow up in. Yi Mulin and Wen Yuan were married. She couldn't let them divorce for herself and Nen. Mubai lost his memory. Even if he didn't lose his memory, he and Wen Yuan might not be able to go to the end. She couldn't be so selfish. Just like that, with extremely complicated feelings, she drove to her parents' apartment. When she carried in and out of the car and then whispered, "Mom, it doesn't matter. No matter how many children Dad has, I'm still Dad's." These words sounded sweet, but Baishuli's face darkened. "Bainan, I gave birth to you." Bainan looked at her anxiously before saying softly, "Without Daddy, you wouldn't have been able to give birth." "Mommy, I heard people say that giving birth is very painful. I found out last night. Daddy made you cry. Is it very painful?" This book comes from Chapter 3670. Baishuli's face darkened. Bainan stared at her with her big eyes. "Dad said I want to buy shares. Does that mean I'll have an Anan after that?" She hugged Baishuli's neck and said softly, "Mom, give birth to another one. Then we'll have 2 babies." Baishuli rolled her eyes. "I'm not a pig. Mom is not a pig. I'm a sow." Bainan giggled. "A sow can give birth to several babies at a time." Baishuli was speechless. "Who taught you all this?" Bainan betrayed her father very quickly. "It's Dad. He said he wants to have more babies with Mom. He said that if Mom cries at night, the baby should not come out. Otherwise, the babies will be too scared to come out." Baishuli was about to faint. This wasn't something the leader would say. It was a hooligan. He would teach children bad things like this. "Don't tell others about this, okay?" She could only tell an Anan this way. An Anan nodded. "I know. Dad said it's a secret." Baishuli rolled her eyes. Bainan was poisoned by Yi Mulin. As they talked, they arrived at the apartment where Mr. and Mrs. Bai lived. The door opened, and Mrs. Bai's face was twisted with excitement. "Baishuli is back." Then, she hugged an Anan and kissed her. "This is the first time I've seen an Anan." Bainan was not shy with strangers. She called her grandmother affectionately. Mrs. Bai looked at Bainan's buzz cut and sighed. Her gaze was also a little complicated. "Surely, Anan's hair is too casual." Baishuli smiled and closed the door. "It's safe this way. There are so many perverts outside. I think you're the first pervert." Mrs. Bai had recovered and returned to her old self. She scolded Baishuli. In the past, Baishuli hated it. But now, she felt warmth and an indescribable peace of mind. She smiled. "I'll leave a doll's head in the future, right?" If she dared to cut an Anan's hair again, Yi Mulin would probably be the first to punish her. Mrs. Bai was satisfied. Then she thought of something. By the way, how are you and Yi Mulin? After asking this question, Mrs. Bai stopped. It was better for Nin to avoid it. So she handed Nin over to Mr. Bai and took her to the children's room to play. Mrs. Bai took her daughter to the sofa to care about her. Bai Shuali thought about it and smiled. That's it. Mom, you know he has a family. Mrs. Bai was much more open-minded now. Have you been with him these past few days? Bai Shuali nodded vigorously. Mrs. Bai thought about it and sighed. I can see that he likes you. Yi Zhenggang hurt our family, and Mulin's mother was hurt too. It's hard for Mulin. You have to understand. But about his family, Shuali, it's not that I'm heartless, but women have to be selfish sometimes. When she was pregnant, you were pregnant too. You left because of us. As long as Yi Mulin likes you, it's reasonable for him to divorce and remarry with you. Mrs. Bai felt sorry for her daughter. Shuali had suffered a lot in the past few years. They couldn't help but drag her down. In fact, they knew about Yi Mulin's contributions to the Bai family. Things are different now. Yi Zhenggang had retired. They could accept it. Yi Zhenggang was Yi Zhenggang, and Yi Mulin was Yi Mulin. Yi Zhenggang, that bastard, did everything he could to make life difficult for the Bai family. In the end, he became a loner. He deserved it. If Shuali remarried Mulin, he would be even more angry with the old bastard. Mrs. Bai thought about it and felt good. There were many versions of it. Bai Shuali smiled bitterly. Let's talk about it later. In fact, I'm a little strange with him. If it weren't for Nin, I don't think it would be possible. Mrs. Bai was anxious when she heard it. The child has been born for him. Why can't you ask for a little more? Then she said, Shuali, I tell you, men can't be too spoiled. If you give in to him a little, you will really become his mistress in the future. What do you think about an Anne's future? Bai Shuali was a little embarrassed. What about Xiangnan? It's certain that he and Wen Yuan have no feelings for each other, but Xiangnan also needs a father. Mrs. Bai looked around and seemed a little nervous. Then she came over and whispered, Shuali, don't you think Xiangnan looks like someone? Mrs. Bai hated Yi Zhenggang to the core. After Yi Mulin and Wen Yuan got married and gave birth to Yi Xianan, Mrs. Bai naturally sneaked a peek at the hospital many times. She covered her head and secretly peeked at places like the hospital. In the end, she discovered something terrible. Bai Shuali's heart skipped a beat. Who does he look like? This book comes from. Chapter 3671. Mrs. Bai said mysteriously, Don't you think he looks like Yi Zhenggang? Bai Shuali was drinking tea. Hearing this, she spat out the tea in her mouth. She looked at her mother with an indescribable expression. In her heart, she was thinking the doctor said that her mother had recovered from her illness. Now, she really doubted it. Was she really recovered? Bai Shuali calmed herself down and coughed. Mom, what are you thinking? It's normal for a child to look like his grandfather. Mrs. Bai continued to speak mysteriously, but they don't look normal. They don't look like Mulin. Do you think Mulin didn't do it with Wen Yuan? And Yi Zhenggang didn't have a wife, so they slept together? Mrs. Bai's thoughts were completely influenced by the old ladies after she was hospitalized. Bai Shuali didn't dare to provoke her, so she said, It's impossible for it to be with Yi Zhenggang. Mrs. Bai nodded, as if she had accepted her daughter's words. Bai Shuali said in a low voice, Mom, these words can only be said at home. You can't say it outside. Although the child was Mu Bai's, if Wen Yuan didn't want to make it public or couldn't be with Mu Bai, the child could only be Yi Mulin's. If Yi Mu Bai was willing to accept it, no one could say anything, including her. Bai Shuali thought of Yi Mu Bai. She missed the days when she chased after Mu Bai, because at that time, there was someone who would always follow her. She was lost in thought for a moment, then she smiled. Why did she think so much? It was all in the past, but she really missed it. Bai Shuali came back to reality and patted the back of her mother's hand. Mom, I'll accompany you to cook. Mrs. Bai nodded and smiled, as if she had forgotten what she said before. Actually, she had recovered from her illness, but her memory wasn't as good as before. She would always forget things. But compared to before, she was much better. During the most difficult time, It was Yi Mulin who protected the Bai family. Bai Shuili knew this very well. She and Mrs. Bai were cooking. When it was almost noon, Yi Mulin called. He must have finished his work. Bai Shuili picked up the phone and asked, "Are you translating at home?" "No, I'm cooking." She pretended to be indifferent. Yi Mulin paused. "Which house are you cooking at?" Bai Shuili was a little confused. After a long time, she said, "In the apartment." I called the landline at home, but no one answered. His voice was cold. "What did you take it in?" Bai Shuili immediately understood that he was thinking of ways to monitor her. Just like before, he was just short of putting her under house arrest. She was angry and snorted. "Yi Mulin, I don't need to report to you where I'm taking it in." On the other side, Yi Mulin was playing with a fish tank in his hands. He said softly, "Do you still remember Little White?" Bai Shuili was stunned. "You said you made it into turtle soup?" He chuckled. "If you don't come home before 5 o'clock tonight, I'll really make it into tortoise soup for my subordinates." "All right, I'll take a photo for you later." Little White has grown quite big and is quite meaty. It should taste very good. Thigh is thigh. Xiong is xiong. Bai Shuili's face was about to smoke. He said little tortoise, but why did she have a feeling that he was talking about her? What did he mean by xiong is xiong and thigh is xiong? She hung up the phone, and the other side quickly sent a photo. It was a photo of a little tortoise, and it had grown up. She was even more surprised by the photo frame on the desk. The person in the photo was her, Bai Shuili, who was in her 20s. This book came from Chapter 3672. Bai Shuili looked at him, and her eyes were watery. She felt like crying. After a long time, he called, and Bai Shuili picked up the call. Yi Mulin's voice was hoarse. "Have you thought about it?" There was silence on the other side. After a long time, she suddenly said, "Then you can stew Xiao Xiao Bai, as long as you are willing." He was a little surprised. Then he smiled. His voice was low and hoarse. It was as if he was teasing her ear through the phone. He said, "Shuili, you're taking advantage of my reluctance, aren't you?" She bit her lip and felt like she was being teased. Then she hung up the phone. On the other side, Yi Mulin looked at the phone and smiled. He put down the phone and played with Xiao Xiao Bai with his slender fingers. Xiao Xiao Bai was originally hiding its head, but now it felt the warmth of his fingers and quietly stretched its head out. Yi Mulin's voice was low and elegant. "Yes." Then he smiled again. He could easily guess where Bai Shuili had gone. Other than the Bai family, there was no other place she could go. It would be easy to catch her. However, he heard that Mulin and Wan Yuan weren't doing well. So he went to the hospital that night. Mubai was still there. He looked at Yi Mulin with a complicated expression. Yi Mulin was concerned about Xiangnan's condition. Wan Yuan said that he could be discharged in 2 days. Actually, Yi Mulin knew that he could stay for a few more days, but Wan Yuan avoided Mubai. Since he was here, Yi Mubai naturally had no reason to stay. However, he still smoked a few cigarettes with Yi Mulin before he left. It was very quiet in the dark corridor of the hospital. Any sound near or far seemed so abrupt. In the flickering light of the cigarette, but Yi Mubai's handsome face was a little unpredictable. After a long time, he asked his brother, "Don't you love Wan Yuan?" Yi Mulin smiled and leaned against the wall. "Why do you ask?" "Bai Shuili and the child she gave birth to for you. She is your ex-wife, isn't she?" Yi Mubai stared at him. Yi Mulin raised his head and smoked a cigarette. Then he smiled and said, "Looks like you've investigated everything in the past 2 days." "Yes, I've always liked Bai Shuili, is that wrong?" "I didn't break up with her willingly." "What's wrong with a successful man trying to get his ex-wife back to be with the woman he loves the most?" "I don't think I'm wrong." Yi Mubai ground his teeth. "What about Wan Yuan? What is she to you?" Yi Mulin looked at his beloved brother and smiled. "Wan Yuan is a very suitable wife, more suitable than Shirley." Yi Mubai sneered. "Bai Shuili is for love, and Wan Yuan is just a decoration. Is that what you mean?" Yi Mulin was still smiling. "That's about it." "Why, Mubai, are you uncomfortable because of Shuel Li or Wan Yuan?" "You used to quarrel with me because of Shirley." Yi Mubai stared at his face for a few seconds before saying coldly, "It has nothing to do with me. You're on your own." He took a few steps forward and turned around to look at Yi Mulin. If when Yuan goes to America, I can take care of him. But don't forget that he's your wife. Yi Mulin smiled faintly and left with Yi Mubai. Yi Mulin smoked another cigarette and went back to the ward with his back to Xiangnan. He asked, quarreled? When Yuan was making juice for Xiangnan. His hand paused for a moment and he whispered, no, it's... She raised her head and looked at Yi Mulin. She felt at ease when facing Yi Mulin because he wasn't as emotional as Yi Mubai. He took care of her like a brother. She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1, husband addicted to pampering. On WeChat, she followed Yuda literature, talking about life and looking for confidence. Chapter 3673. I'm here to catch the runaway child. For when Yuan sometimes wondered why she didn't fall in love with Yi Mulin. It was probably because he gave her a warm feeling. In fact, men wouldn't be so gentle towards the woman they liked. She knew that clearly, so it was impossible for her and Yi Mulin. She thought for a moment and said in a low voice, I think I might be wrong. Her voice was getting more and more bitter. From the moment he disappeared a few years ago, from the moment he didn't like me, I shouldn't have persisted. She raised her head. Maybe we shouldn't have gotten married. Maybe I shouldn't have had hope, but I don't regret it. Because Xiangnan is so good, and so are you. They treat me very well. Yi Mulin sighed and touched her hair. When Yuan, no matter what, as long as you are willing, I will always take care of you and Xiangnan. Don't worry about Xiueli. She's not what she looks like on the surface. She's actually a very good girl. When Yuan smiled. In your heart, Bai Xiueli has always been a little girl, right? Yes, little girl. Yi Mulin smiled too. Don't think too much. Just be happy. When Yuan nodded. That night, Yi Mulin stayed to accompany Xiangnan. Xiangnan was quite happy and wanted to sleep with Yi Mulin. It was rare for the little guy to be so clingy. Of course, Yi Mulin would satisfy him. In the middle of the night, Xiangnan couldn't fall asleep. Yi Mulin touched his little head. What's wrong, Xiangnan? Xiangnan pursed his lips and said in a low voice, Uncle Mubai is my father, right? Yi Mulin's mood was a bit complicated. He thought for a moment and said in a low voice, Does Xiangnan like Uncle? Yes, but Uncle doesn't seem to like Mommy. I want Mommy to be happy. Xiangnan hugged Yi Mulin. I'll go wherever Mommy goes. I'll follow Mommy. Yi Mulin's heart was a bit bitter. Xiangnan was so young, but he was already very sensible. It made his heart ache. He hugged the little guy and said softly, If Xiangnan is willing, Uncle can always take care of you. Xiangnan didn't say anything and just hugged him. Yi Mulin closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He left early the next morning and communicated with the doctor to confirm that there was no problem. He went to the office and sat there, still thinking about Wen Yuan and Mubai. As for himself and Bai Xiueli, their relationship was already very stable. In the past, he could control her, and it would be the same now and in the future. As he thought about it, he looked at Xiao Bai, who was at his desk. Hence, he pressed the internal line to call for Secretary Li. Secretary Li came over. Chief. Yi Mulin reached out his hand and took out the little turtle from the box. He placed it on his palm and gently rubbed it for a while. He smiled casually and said, Help me make a trip to the Bai family. I'll write you the address and send something over. All right, go and wrap it up like a cake. Put this little white inside and let her open it herself. Don't tell anyone. After he said that, Secretary Li widened his eyes and looked at his boss. It's not good to send a tortoise back, is it? What if Shirley sends it back to you? That wouldn't be good. Yi Mulin looked at his secretary and snorted coldly. You're getting better at talking. Secretary Li squeezed out a smile and chuckled. In order to make her boss happy and to eat, she had to send a tortoise. An hour later, the fresh tortoise was beautifully wrapped and sent to Bai Xiueli. Secretary Li coughed softly. This is a gift from the chief. End of this chapter. Chapter 3674. I am here to catch a runaway 5. Bai Xiueli looked at Secretary Li with an amused expression. Secretary Li smiled awkwardly. No matter what, it's a token of appreciation from the bureau chief. I'll take my leave first. She had to leave as soon as possible. If she didn't leave, how could she stay for the new year? Thinking about the little tortoise in the beautifully packaged box, Secretary Lee's scalp went numb. The bureau chief was too evil. Secretary Lee ran off. Bai Shuili looked at the box and flipped it around. Then she said, "No one celebrated their birthday." Mrs. Bai reminded her, "Is it your anniversary? Are you getting married or something?" "No." Bai Shuili opened the box. "It's just an ordinary day. Also, this box is very light. Is it cotton candy?" As she thought about it, she opened it layer by layer. Then she was stunned. There was nothing inside except for a little tortoise. The tortoise stared at her with its bean-like eyes, making her hair stand on end. Then she thought of something and picked up the little tortoise. Little white? Of course, the little tortoise couldn't answer her. He just lay on her palm and stared at her with his beady eyes. Bai Shuili's fingers gently caressed her tortoise head. "I wanted to write asterisk, 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 asterisk. Haha, it's not appropriate to think about it." Little Xiao Bai instinctively shrunk back, but after a while, it carefully popped out its little head and looked at Bai Shuili eagerly. The scene of them recognizing their kin was very touching. Bai Shuili bit her lip and said softly, "Xiao Xiao Bai, you didn't get stewed by Daddy, did you? You've grown so big. You're a big girl now." Bai Anan looked up from the side. "Mommy, does the fact that this little turtle has grown up mean that he can mate now?" Bai Shuili almost fainted. She looked at Bai Anan and asked, "Who taught you this?" Bai Anan stuck out her tongue. "It's written in the books that when animals grow up, they have to mate. It's the same for humans. Otherwise, how can they reproduce?" Bai Shuili still wanted to say something, but Mrs. Bai actually spoke up for Anan. "Anan is right. Shuili, you don't know that when I was in the hospital, I saw too many infertile men. They were all killed by gold after drinking too much. They can't even give a child to a woman. It's useless to have such a man. So, Yi Mulin is not bad. The yield is not bad." Mrs. Bai was talking about Yi Mulin openly and secretly. She was just short of saying that Yi Mulin was strong in that aspect. Bai Shuili couldn't stand her anymore. She found a fish tank and put Little White in it. Then she went downstairs with him to pick a few beautiful stones and put them in. She even got some water plants and then loved it so much that she kept lying there and looking around. Bai Shuili knew that Yi Mulin would probably come over tonight. So during dinner, she slowly said to Mrs. Bai, "Mom, I asked Cece out." Mrs. Bai wasn't happy when she heard that. "You can meet Cece at home if you want to. You have to spend money outside, and you eat her food every time." Although she didn't quite agree, Mrs. Bai still turned around and took out her private 20,000 yuan. She put it in Bai Shuili's palm. "These few years, Cece has taken good care of the two of us. She's even better to you. Treat her well." Bai Shuili declined. "Mom, I have money," Mrs. Bai said without thinking. "Although you can earn money by translating books, it's very limited. You also have to take care of Anan. We sold our house and have some money in our hands. If not you, who should we spend it on? Girls should live a more refined life, or else no one will look at you." Chapter 3675. It has to be said that Mrs. Bai is still the delicate Mrs. Bai. Even if the family has fallen, the spirit in her bones is still there. Bai Shuili still didn't take it and said softly, "Mom, I have money. Recently, I read a book and it sold very well. I got hundreds of thousands of royalties. In addition, some producers want to ask me to write a script. If I succeed, it will be better and better in the future." Mrs. Bai was silent for a while, and then whispered, "Shuili, Mom knows that you can work and support yourself now, but Mom still can't bear to let you go. I still love you. Think about how you used to live like a prince and didn't do anything. Although you can earn money outside, Mom is afraid that you will look at other people's faces. I still feel sorry for you. Mom, who doesn't look at other people's faces and don't feel wronged when doing things outside. Even Dad used to be Yi Mulin, and now there are still times when it is difficult. Don't think too much. I'm fine now." She wiped away Mrs. Bai's tears. "Mom, no matter what happens between me and Yi Mulin, I don't want him to support me anymore. At least I can earn money, so that no matter when I can live in this world, I can give Anan and you a stable life." After she finished, Mrs. Bai couldn't help crying again and whispered, "Shueli, you have grown up. You have really grown up. Mom is very happy. You are right. It is reasonable. Look at me. I'm a bloody example. I can't do anything to help your father when he collapsed. I can only blame you for being sick and dragging you down like that. Surely, I'm really sorry." Bai Shueli also felt bad in her heart. She reluctantly smiled. "Mom, what are you talking about? As long as you are well, it's fine. Our family is fine now. Don't talk about things that are unfair." She changed the topic. "Don't make me cry, or else Cece will spout nonsense again. Her imagination is very rich." Speaking of this, Mrs. Bai suddenly looked at the bruise on her daughter's chin. "By the way, what's going on with your chin? Does Mulin like something different now?" Bai Shueli's expression was as if she was constipated. Mrs. Bai thought about it and said, "He is under a lot of pressure. If he has any requirements, you should try to cooperate with him. It's nothing." Bai Shueli's face was as red as blood. "Mom, what are you thinking about? Yi Mulin made it." Mrs. Bai's face was still full of confusion. "I know he pinched me, but is Mulin very rough? If that's the case, I have to persuade him. He can't be too rough. This kind of thing cannot be consensual." Bai Shueli rolled her eyes and said, "Mom, it's not what you think. It's really just a simple pinch." Mrs. Bai wasn't too happy. Has he been cooped up for too long? Has he become a pervert? Bai Shueli felt that it wasn't Yi Mulin who was a pervert, but her mother who was now a pervert. His thinking was so avant-garde. She met Lin Cece in a bar for a drink. She couldn't help but complain, "Cece, do you think my parents will live without sex for the rest of their lives?" That's why she speaks so boldly. Lin Cece was dying from laughter. She tilted her head and said, "You can ask her directly. She's already so straightforward." Bai Shueli laughed. "I'm sorry, but what if there isn't? Wouldn't that agitate her to death?" Lin Cece couldn't stop laughing. She leaned on the table and didn't get up for a long time. She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1, husband addicted to pampering. She followed Yuta Literature on WeChat, talking about life, looking for bosom friends. Chapter 3676. Bai Shueli rubbed her forehead. "Is it that funny?" Lin Cece laughed for a while and looked up. "Yes, it's so funny. Shueli, it's so funny when you think of what your mother said." Bai Shueli glanced at her and took the glass. "Drink." Lin Cece was also very bold. After drinking half a glass, she clinked glasses with Bai Shueli. "Cheers to our reunion." Putting down the wine glass, she asked in a low voice, "Cece, let's settle down. Don't go back to America. What's so good about America? We just have to eat fried chicken every day. How can it compare to living in B City? If you stay in B City, we can still get together often. Besides, Uncle and Annie aren't young anymore. They'll be lonely without you." Bai Shueli was stunned. After a while, she forced a smile. "Cece, you're right. Sometimes, I also feel that I'm a coward." She put her hands in front of her. "At that time, I was very scared. I found out that I was pregnant, but when Yuan was pregnant with Mubai's child, Mubai was missing, and it was very likely that he was gone. My father was in prison, and my mother was crazy. I had no choice." Lin Cece put her fingers on the back of her hand and whispered, "Shueli, that's because you didn't learn to trust Yi Mulin. I can't say anything else, but at least he can take good care of you and when Yuan, just like now." "Just like now?" Bai Shueli was a little lost. Lin Cece smiled faintly and said, "Yes, just like now. Shueli, have you ever thought that Xiangnan is Yi Mubai's child? No matter how you look at it, no matter which man wants Wen Yuan, that man won't be Yi Mubai. In other words, no matter who happens in this world, Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan can't be together. They can only be a nominal couple. He just wants to give Wen Yuan's child a part of the Yi family. I think if you didn't leave, they wouldn't have gotten married. After getting married, you would probably feel safe and dare to come back." Lin Cece's analysis was very logical. Bai Shueli was stunned. After a while, she murmured, "I think he said that once. He said that he hasn't had a woman for a few years." "Did he say that after you did it?" Lin Cece smirked. Bai Shueli blushed and stared at her. "Lin Cece, does Gu Zane know that you're so bad?" Lin Cece was stunned for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. Why mention him? Nothing to do with me? As soon as she finished speaking, Bai Shuili's face had already moved in front of hers. Is it really okay? Yeah, Lin Cece said stubbornly. Bai Shuili's face was full of disbelief. Look at your face. I don't believe that nothing happened. Lin Cece was stunned. She touched her face. You can tell? Bai Shuili couldn't stop laughing. After laughing for a long time, she said, Cece, you really believed it? Now you're confessing without being pressed. Lin Cece was speechless. Bai Shuili handed him a glass of wine. Drink this. She wanted to get Lin Cece drunk, but how could her alcohol tolerance be enough for Lin Cece? Asterisk while they were drinking, Yi Mulin was at the Bai family's house. As soon as she opened the door, Mrs. Bai was stunned. Mulin, Mom. Yi Mulin walked in and helped Mrs. Bai. He was holding some supplements in his hand. While changing his shoes, he asked naturally, Is Dad here? Book from. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.